I would just like to preface this commentary of the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham by framing it with a little context. Although I am an agnostic atheist and a naturalistic pantheist, my motivation for making this commentary has nothing to do with my opinions of religions in general, and everything to do with my respect for the truth, which for the purposes of this commentary will be defined as the set of things that correspond to observable reality. It is my position that Ken Ham's stance on the creation of the universe and the things inside of it does not fall within the parameters of this definition of truth, nor any other definition that could serve any practical purpose for anyone. It is my intention to expose the lies, fallacies, and misrepresentations promulgated by Ken Ham and his associates, who I regard as dangerous adversaries to the common interests of society, interests that include the well-being and security of future generations, as well as the social and academic literacy of the general population. Over the years, I have monitored and scrutinized the activities of Ken Ham and others like him, which has led me to form an opinion about the shady group of individuals to which Mr. Ham belongs. This opinion will become increasingly apparent as the commentary progresses, and so as my tone becomes more scathing over the course of this video, I beseech the audience to keep in mind that religion in general is not the target of my condemnation. It is the opportunistic fundamentalist individuals like Ken Ham to whom I restrict my ire, and neither his belief in God nor alleged devotion to him are factors that I have taken into account when forming my opinion. That all having been said, I present to you a minute-by-minute commentary of the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham.
Good evening. I'm pleased to welcome you to Legacy Hall of the Creation Museum in northern Kentucky in the metropolitan area of Cincinnati. I'm Tom Foreman from CNN, and I'm pleased to be tonight's moderator for this evolution versus creation debate. And now, Mr. Ham, you opted to go first, so you will be first with your 5-minute opening statement.
Well, good evening. I know that not everyone watching this debate will necessarily agree with what I have to say, but I'm an Aussie and live over here in America, and they tell me I have an accent, and so it doesn't matter what I say. Some people tell me, we just like you hear saying it. So I hope you enjoy me saying it anyway. Well, the debate topic is this: is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? You know, when this was first announced on the internet, there are lots of statements like this one from the Richard Dawkins Foundation: scientists should not debate creationists, period. And this one from one of the discovery.com websites: should scientists debate creationists? You know, right here I believe there's a gross misrepresentation in our culture. We're seeing people in being indoctrinated to believe that creationists can't be scientists. I believe it's all a part of secularists hijacking the word science. I want you to meet a modern-day scientist who is a biblical creationist.
The argument from authority will be a recurring theme in this debate from Ham's side. He's going to introduce a number of academics who accept literal creationism in an effort to bolster the authority of his arguments. We will notice some recurring themes with these academics.
My name is Stuart Burgess. I'm a Professor of Engineering Design at Bristol University in the UK. My name is Stuart Burgess. I'm a Professor of Engineering Design at Bristol University in the UK. I have published over 130 scientific papers on the science of design in engineering and biological systems. From my research work, I have found that the scientific evidence fully supports creationism as the best explanation to origins. I've also designed major parts of spacecraft launched by ESA and NASA.
Stuart Burgess has impressive credentials and is an accomplished engineer with an emphasis on biometrics. He is also on the payroll of the British creationist organization Truth and Science, where he acts as a head of its Council of Reference. Though he claims that his research fully supports creationism, he has never published a peer-reviewed paper whose topic pertained to creationism in any academic journal.
So here's a biblical creationist who's a scientist who's also an inventor, and I want young people to understand that. You know, the problem, I believe, is this: we need to define terms correctly. We need to define creation, evolution in regard to origins, and we need to define science. And in this opening statement, I want to concentrate on dealing with the word science. I believe the word science has been hijacked by secularists. Now, what is science? Well, the origin of the word comes from the classical Latin scientia, which means to know. And if you look up a dictionary, it'll say science means state of knowing, knowledge. But there's different types of knowledge, and I believe this is where the confusion lies. There's experimental or observational science, as we call it. That's using the scientific method, observation, measurement, experiment, testing. That's what produces our technology, computers, spacecraft, jet planes, smoke detectors, looking at DNA, antibiotics, medicines and vaccines. You see, all scientists, whether creationists or evolutionists, actually have the same observational or experimental science. And it doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, you can be a great scientist. For instance, here's an atheist who is a great scientist, Craig Venter, one of the first researchers to sequence the human genome. Or Dr. Raymond Damadian. He is a man who invented the MRI scanner and revolutionized medicine. He's a biblical creationist. But I want us to also understand molecules to man evolution belief has nothing to do with developing technology.
Incorrect. Here's a list of peer-reviewed engineering papers that discuss the use of evolutionary algorithms in designing and constructing aeronautic apparatuses. These algorithms and the feats of engineering that they produce owe their existence to and are a direct consequence of the theory that you deny.
You see, when we're talking about origins, we're talking about the past. We're talking about our origins. We weren't there. You can't observe that, whether it's molecules to man evolution or whether it's a creation account. When you're talking about the past, we like to call that origins or historical science, knowledge concerning the past. Here at the Creation Museum, we make no apology about the fact that our origins or historical science actually is based upon the biblical account of origins. Now, when you research science textbooks being used in public schools, what we found is this. By and large, the origins or historical science is based upon man's ideas about the past, for instance, the ideas of Darwin.
We have now reached the foundation of Ken Ham's argument, and I will now take the time to briefly elucidate the structure of his defense. Ken Ham intends to first create an illusory distinction between the topics in science that contradict his worldview and the ones that do not. He has labeled them historical and observational science, a concept that he first introduced a year ago when responding to Bill Nye's Big Think video. Next, he intends to commit the fallacy of equivocation by equating both creationism and evolution as having an equal amount of epistemological support because of some unidentified insurmountable epistemic barrier that the passage of time presents. He justifies this idea of what I like to call anti-uniformitarianism by arguing that our inability to directly observe a phenomenon renders any study pertaining to it unreliable. After establishing that evolution and creationism, both allegedly belonging to the same subset of scientific topics that require faith, are on equal ground, he intends to make it seem as though creationism, despite allegedly being equal in scientific merit to evolution, is not being equally represented in the classroom. He intends to cast the aspersion that the rationalists, whom he demonizes with the spiteful moniker of secularists, are attempting to push an explicitly anti-God agenda into politics and education. To make it seem as though evolution is an attempt to subvert the Christian way of life, and not merely a model that explains the biodiversity of life on Earth, he will conflate evolutionary theory with social Darwinism and eugenics. He will name-drop several creationist academics in an effort to make it seem as though there is a serious controversy in the scientific community on this matter, and he will liberally sprinkle his entire argument with suggestions of a satanic scientific conspiracy. This argument, while elegantly structured, fails on every level, and I intend to address and debunk each level in depth. Because this structure of Ham's stance is the aggregate of every matter that he ignorantly chooses to babble about, I thought that it would be particularly apt to name this model Ken Ham's Tower of Babel. Over the course of this video, keep this model in mind. This is the general structure of Ken Ham's position, and I will be tearing it down layer by layer.
And our research has found that public school textbooks are using the same word science for observational science and historical science. They arbitrarily define science as naturalism and outlaw the supernatural. They present molecules to man evolution as fact. They are imposing, I believe, the religion of naturalism or atheism on generations of students. You see, I assert that the word science has been hijacked by secularists in teaching evolution to force the religion of naturalism on generations of kids.
I will ignore the fact that neither atheism nor naturalism are religions, as well as the fact that public schools are constitutionally prohibited from dissuading students from their spiritual beliefs, and instead will take a moment to focus on historical and observational science and how both rely on the scientific method. There is no serious distinction between these two categories. While they may rely on differing techniques and procedures, the underlying scientific method is essentially identical, and the differences between historical and observational science, as far as functionality is concerned, are no less arbitrary between the differences between classical and quantum physics, or between the life and physical sciences. The purpose of all scientific disciplines is to create models, colloquially referred to as theories, that among other things have predictive power, and all of the sciences that Ken Ham dismisses as historical meets this criteria. Creationism, on the other hand, is not a theory. Generally speaking, in order to qualify as a theory, a model must meet the following requirements. First and foremost, it needs to have predictive capabilities. This means that it accurately tells us how some aspect of the world is going to behave under certain circumstances. More broadly, it tells us that when we manipulate variables a, b, and c, we can expect to observe corresponding effects x, y, and z. This serves as the basis for finding patterns, which allows us to make predictions about future data. That's the goal of science, to predict the future. The next criteria is independent verifiability and falsifiability. This means that anybody with the proper equipment will be able to vindicate the predictions made by the scientific model, or, if the model is inaccurate, anybody with the proper equipment will be able to disprove it by finding a statistically significant amount of data that contradicts the predictions. Finally, a theory must also have parsimonious explanatory power. This means that any extraneous aspect of the theory that the model doesn't necessarily rely upon can be removed because it adds an unnecessary assumption, which can constrain the scope of the model's predictive power. As Bill Nye does an excellent job of reiterating, creationism does not meet the first criteria, and by extension cannot meet the second or third criteria. This is because without predictive capabilities, a model cannot be tested, and since a model's explanatory power is necessarily dependent on our ability to verify its validity, a model without predictive power is untestable and consequently has no explanatory power. The failure of creationism is therefore fractal. It doesn't make predictions about future data, so it cannot be tested, so it cannot explain anything. So in summary, the distinction between historical and observational science is meaningless. There is only science, and creationism is not a part of it.
Secular evolutionists teach that all life developed by natural processes from some primordial form, that man is just an evolved animal, which has great bearing on how we view life and death. For instance, as Bill states,
it's very hard to accept for many of us that when you die, it's over.
But you see, the Bible gives a totally different account of origins, of who we are, where we came from, the meaning of life, and our future. That through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin, but that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whoever believes in him should not perish and have everlasting life. So, is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? I say the creation-evolution debate is a conflict between two philosophical worldviews based on two different accounts of origins or science beliefs, and creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era.
And that is time. I have the unenviable job of being the timekeeper here. So I'm like the referee in football that you don't like. But I will periodically, if either one of our debaters runs over on anything, I will stop them in the name of keeping it fair for all. Mr. Ham, thank you for your comments. Now it's Mr. Nye's turn for a 5-minute opening statement. Mr. Nye.
At this point, Bill Nye came onto the stage and made 2 points that need to be taken into serious consideration. One of them is that the majority of Christians reject the dogmatic ideology of Ken Ham. The other is that Ken Ham's pontifications on the superiority of observational science to historical science is nonsensical. He brought up the example of CSI, which is a TV show that's based on the scientific principles that underlie forensic pathology. The point that Bill Nye was trying to make was that even though murders are committed regularly and without witnesses, it is possible to identify and convict the perpetrators using science. In other words, you don't need to directly observe a phenomenon in order to vindicate its veracity. You can examine the evidence pertaining to it and come to a conclusion by using the scientific method. In Ken Ham's worldview, this shouldn't be possible because the murder took place in the past and is therefore inaccessible to us. I'll go more in depth on this point later. For now, let's listen to the diatribe that Ken Ham has prepared for his audience over the last few decades before we completely demolish it in a matter of minutes.
Well, the debate topic was, is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? And I made this statement at the end of my opening statement. Creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era. And I said, what we need to be doing is actually defining our terms, and particularly 3 terms: science, creation, and evolution. Now, I discussed the meaning of the word science and what is meant by experimental or observational science briefly, and that both creationists and evolutionists can be great scientists, for instance. I mentioned Craig Venter, a biologist, he's an atheist, and he's a great scientist. He was one of the first researchers to sequence the human genome. I also mentioned Dr. Raymond Damadian, who actually invented the MRI scanner. I want you to meet a biblical creationist who is a scientist and inventor.
Hi, my name is Dr. Raymond Damadian. I am a young Earth creation scientist and believe that God created the world in 6 24-hour days, just as recorded in the book of Genesis. By God's grace and the devoted prayers of my godly mother-in-law, I invented the MRI scanner in 1969. The idea that scientists who believe the Earth is 6,000 years old cannot do real science is simply wrong.
Well, he's most adamant about that.
Raymond Damadian has a long and impressive career, yet he has never published a single article in the peer review in defense of creationism. Nobody claims that holding a creationist viewpoint guarantees universal scientific illiteracy, merely that there is a direct and undeniable correlation. Where nearly half of Americans accept some variation of literal creationism, only about 1 out of 25 Americans hold a degree in science or engineering, and of the small percentage of those degree holders who are actually full-time scientists, only 1 out of 50 are creationists. If we include engineers into the figure, we're dealing with no more than 5% of the scientific community being some variation of creationist. There is certainly a correlation between holding a creationist viewpoint and academic illiteracy, and that is cause for concern. Outliers like Raymond Damadian do exist, as they do in every data set. Accomplished historian David Irving is a Holocaust denier. Charles Berlitz, an expert linguist, believed in Atlantis. Of the estimated 3 million architects and engineers in the world, about 2,000 of them think that the United States government blew up the Twin Towers. And of all the scientists who work in fields relevant to evolutionary theory, barely 1% of them reject it. You can cherry-pick scientists all you like, Ham, but you will never be able to provide us with a single example of a creationist article that has made it into the academic peer-reviewed journal.
And actually, he revolutionized medicine. He's a biblical creationist. And I encourage children to follow people like that and make them their heroes. Let me introduce you to another biblical creation scientist.
My name is Danny Faulkner. I received my PhD in astronomy from Indiana University. For 26 and a half years, I was professor at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where I hold the rank of Distinguished Professor Emeritus. Upon my retirement from the university in January of 2013, I joined the research staff at Answers in Genesis. I'm a stellar astronomer. That means my primary interest is stars, but I'm particularly interested in the study of eclipsing binary stars. And I've published many articles in the astronomy literature, places such as the Astrophysical Journal, the Astronomical Journal, and the Observatory. There is nothing in observational astronomy that contradicts a recent creation.
Curiously enough, despite his adamant belief that this is the case, Faulkner has never published a single article in the peer review that explains how astronomy can be rationally reconciled with his belief in a 6,000-year-old universe. As someone whose major is deeply relevant to astronomy, I took particularly special care in examining this man's arguments on the Answers in Genesis website. I was left dumbstruck by the sheer inanity of his arguments. Just so that we have some perspective, this is what an actual peer-reviewed paper looks like. In order to gain access to a peer-reviewed journal, an article has to meet the most rigorous academic standards imaginable, and even then, publication is unlikely. Only the best of the best get published, and when they do, that's only the beginning. The article has to withstand the scrutiny of every scientist in the field who comes across it until pretty much the end of time. This article was written by Danny Faulkner on the topic of binary star systems. You'll notice that it meets a certain caliber of thoroughness and sophistication, and as advanced as this paper is, it's rather short and doesn't have too many references. As far as peer-reviewed papers go, this one isn't that serious. Not that that's a bad thing. Not all contributions can be earth-shattering, and in all fairness, this paper has a decent amount of citations. In short, this is what science looks like. This is what science doesn't look like. It's an article by the same person on the Answers in Genesis website. Here's a quote from a passage in this loaded, poorly written, academically uncited drivel that has unjustly been dignified as an article. Is there anything that we can salvage from all this? Despite the damage wrought by purveyors of the gospel and the stars, the surprising answer is yes, we can. In speaking about the constellations, such as in planetarium shows, we can make parallels to spiritual truths. For instance, a discussion of Virgo the Virgin can easily lead to the discussion of the conception and birth of Jesus Christ. This is not so different from using parables as Jesus did. He alluded to everyday examples that his listeners could relate to. This man has worked for years in a scientific discipline that is notorious for its meticulous calculations involving highly advanced math and physical principles so technical that any casual eavesdropper on a conversation involving them would think that a different language is being spoken. In spite of everything he has learned, in spite of all that he has worked for, Faulkner has written an unsighted paper that can be grasped by most 10-year-olds, and on top of that, he is seriously endorsing astrology, the very pseudoscience that astronomy replaced centuries ago. Had he tried to submit this to a peer-reviewed journal, I have little doubt that the committee reviewing it would immediately contact his parent academic institution to request the revocation of his PhD. Danny Faulkner is on the Answers in Genesis payroll, and all that he has to do to earn his money is occasionally write half-baked pseudoscientific papers like this and act as an academic mascot in order to inflate Ken Ham's authority. To the casual viewer, I can assure you that doing this is much less difficult than doing this, and judging from the $43 million tax break that the Creation Museum received a couple of years ago, I strongly suspect that it also pays a lot more. Doesn't it, Danny?
I also mentioned Dr. Stuart Burgess, Professor of Engineering Design at Bristol University in England. Now, he designed a double-action worm gear set for the 3 hinges of the robotic arm on a very expensive satellite. And if that had not worked, if that gear set had not worked, that whole satellite would have been useless. Yet Dr. Burgess is a biblical creationist who believes just as I believe. Now, think about this for a moment. Are scientists like Dr. Burgess, who believe in creation, just as I do, a small minority in the scientific world? But let's see what he says about scientists believing in creation.
I find that many of my colleagues in academia are sympathetic to the creationist viewpoint, including biologists. However, they are often afraid to speak out because of the criticisms they would get from the media and atheist lobby.
Oh, right, because scientists are so afraid of new ideas. Scientists have no interest in models that lack predictive power, and unless creationism shows itself to have that capability, people will be perfectly justified in laughing at it and ridiculing creationists.
I agree, that's a real problem today. We need to have freedom to be able to speak on these topics. You know, I just want to say, by the way, that non-Christian scientists, I should say, non-Christian scientists are really borrowing from the Christian worldview anyway to carry out their experimental or observational science. Think about it. When they're doing observational science using the scientific method, they have to assume the laws of logic, they have to assume the laws of nature, they have to assume the uniformity of nature. I mean, think about it. If the universe came about by natural processes, where'd the laws of logic come from? Did they just pop into existence? Are we in a stage now where we only have half logic? So you see, I have a question for Bill Nye. How do you account for the laws of logic and the laws of nature from a naturalistic worldview that excludes the existence of God?
Where these laws originated is not relevant to the topic of whether creationism is a viable model, unless of course Ken Ham is trying to use the argument from ignorance to support his idea, which he obviously is. Ken Ham doesn't know where these laws came from, therefore they were created. It may or may not be true, by the way. I concede that it's possible that they were created, but Ken Ham's reasoning is unsatisfactory. In science, you don't just attribute an unknown to whatever conclusion draws your fancy. You do not solve problems this way. You are merely replacing one unknown with another, and that is fallacious. If Ham really wanted to demonstrate that these things were created, it was incumbent upon him to come up with an experiment that would allow us to test his idea and share his results. Instead, he chose to play a semantic word game that incorporated an argument from ignorance. What does that say about the strength of his position? Also, I'd like to draw attention to Ken Ham's endorsement of the uniformity of nature. This is an extremely important point to keep in mind, as it plays a role in forming the disturbing cognitive dissonance that's torturing Ken Ham's thought process.
Now, in my opening statement, I also discussed a different type of science or knowledge, origins or historical science. See, again, there's a confusion here, there's a misunderstanding here. People, by and large, have not been taught to look at what you believe about the past as different to what you're observing in the present. You don't observe the past directly. Even when you think about the creation account, I mean, we can't observe God creating. We can't observe the creation of Adam and Eve. We admit that. we're willing to admit our beliefs about the past. But see, what you see in the present is very different. Even some public school textbooks, actually, well, they sort of acknowledge the difference between historical and observational science. Here is an earth science textbook that's used in public schools, and we read this. In contrast to physical geology, the aim of historical geology is to understand Earth's long history. And then they make the statement, historical geology, so we're talking about historical science, tries to establish a timeline of the vast number of physical and biological changes that have occurred in the past. We study physical geology before historical geology because we first must understand how Earth works before we try to unravel its past. In other words, we observe things in the present and then, okay, we're assuming that that's always happened in the past and we're going to try and figure out how this happened. See, there is a difference between what you observe and what happened in the past.
Again, this is a difference without distinction. We have no reason to believe that geological processes in the past were different from geological processes in the present, and there's an entire multi-billion-dollar industry that owes its very existence to that fact. You may have heard of it, Ham. It's called the global mining industry. Every year, relevant companies from oil and metalworking corporations spend millions of dollars to consult with geologists, who use their understanding of what Ham condescendingly refers to as historical science to advise these companies on where to dig for oil and minerals. These companies then spend billions of dollars on expeditions to these locations based on the scientists' advice. The fossil fuels that were ultimately dug up because of someone's understanding of historical science ended up powering the airplane that brought Bill Nye to the debate at your facility, a facility whose frame likewise came from steel whose components were excavated under similar circumstances. The very building from which you preach the unreliability of historical science owes its existence in large part to historical science in the first place.
Let me illustrate it this way. If Bill Nye and I went to the Grand Canyon, we could agree that that's a Coconino sandstone in the Hermit Shale, and there's the boundary. They're sitting one on top of the other. We could agree on that. But do you know what we would disagree on? I mean, we could even analyze the minerals and agree on that. But we would disagree on how long it took to get there. But see, none of us saw the sandstone or the shale being laid down. There's a supposed 10 million year gap there, but I don't see a gap. But that might be different to what Bill Nye would see. But see, there's a difference between what you actually observe directly and then your interpretation in regard to the past.
Let me illustrate just how vacuous and moronic this argument is with an analogy. A dead body is found. It's been slashed open, decomposing guts are hanging out of the festering carcass, you get the idea. A suspect has been arrested. His DNA was found all over the victim's body, his fingerprints are all over the scene, and in addition to that, he owns a knife that matches the profile of the weapon used to slash open the victim. The suspect's fingerprints are also found on the knife handle, and in addition, traces of the victim's blood are found on the suspect's clothes. Ken Ham is called in to defend the suspect. When the evidence is presented in court, the following is his defense. If the prosecutor and I were to go to the same crime scene, we could agree that the victim was slashed open. There are the guts, there's the blood, we could agree on that. Do you know what we would disagree on? I mean, we could analyze the knife and even agree that it's the murder weapon, but we would disagree on the identity of the killer. See, none of us saw the victim getting murdered. There's supposed evidence of my client's DNA there, but I don't see his DNA. But that might be different to what someone qualified would see. But see, there's a difference between what you actually observe directly and then your interpretation with regard to the past. If you think that this is ridiculous, just wait. Ham is going to say even more outrageous things to this effect, and when he does, I'm going to take this analogy even further. Join us next time on Law & Order's Special Needs Unit.
When I was at the Goddard Space Center a number of years ago, I met creationists and evolutionists who were both working on the Hubble telescope. They agreed on how to build the Hubble telescope. You know what they disagreed on? Well, they disagreed on how to interpret the data the telescope obtained in regard to the age of the universe. And, you know, we could go on and talk about lots of other similar sorts of things. For instance, I've heard Bill Nye talk about how a smoke detector works using the radioactive element americium. And you know what? I totally agree with him on that. We agree how it works. We agree how radioactivity enables that to work. But if you're then going to use radioactive elements and talk about the age of the Earth, you've got a problem because you weren't there. We've got to understand parent elements, daughter elements, and so on. We could agree whether you're a creationist or evolutionist on the technology to put the rover on Mars, but we're going to disagree on how to interpret the origin of Mars. I mean, there are some people that believe there was even a global flood on Mars and there's no liquid water on Mars. But, you know, we're going to disagree maybe on our interpretation of origins, and you can't prove either way because, not from an observational science perspective, because we've only got the present. Creationists and evolutionists both work on medicines and vaccines. You see, it doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, all scientists have the same experimental or observational science. So I have a question for Bill Nye. Can you name one piece of technology that could only have been developed starting with a belief in molecules to man evolution?
The question is malformed because no one starts with a belief in evolution. As with all theories, the evidence is synthesized into a model that predicts future data. In the case of evolution, predictions concerning paleontology, genetics, and ecology have been repeatedly vindicated over the decades, and it is the success of these predictions that serves as the main fruit of the theory. Regarding technology that exists because of the theory, I already gave the example of aeronautics utilizing evolutionary algorithms. Other inventions that utilize evolutionary algorithms include control systems, the code underlying Turing machines, and the possibility of future processors that are capable of hypercomputation. In short, evolutionary theory is responsible for the entire industry of bioinformatics. But let's pretend for a moment that evolutionary theory is not responsible for any inventions. So what? The success of a theory is measured by its ability to predict future data, not by the number of inventions that it's responsible for. Just look at the theory of general equilibrium, which serves as the cornerstone of modern economics. Can you think of any inventions that this theory is responsible for? I can't, but I can tell you that it is absolutely indispensable to modern society because of how successful it is at predicting future data. The theory of general equilibrium might not have been used to build any inventions, but its application has made Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan a hell of a lot of money.
Now, here's another important fact. Creationists and evolutionists all have the same evidence. Bill Nye and I have the same Grand Canyon. We don't disagree on that. We will have the same fish fossil. This is one from the Creation Museum. The same dinosaur skeletons, the same animals, the same humans, the same DNA, the same radioactive decay elements that we see. We have the same universe. Actually, we all have the same evidences. It's not the evidences that are different. It's a battle over the same evidence in regard to how we interpret the past. And you know why that is? Because it's really a battle over worldviews and starting points. It's a battle over philosophical worldviews and starting points, but the same evidence. Now, I admit my starting point is that God is the ultimate authority. But if someone doesn't accept that, then man has to be the ultimate authority. And that's really the difference when it comes down to it.
Wrong. This is yet another attempt to place evolution and creationism on a level playing field, and in order to do this, Ham neglects the single most important difference between these two models. Evolution makes testable predictions that have been validated time and again. Creationism does not. Anybody can take evidence and have it meet their presupposed conclusion. In fact, that is how pseudoscience operates. Ken Ham is openly admitting that creationists take pieces of evidence and try to make them fit their model. Well, Ken, anyone can use that strategy to meet any conclusion. Here's the Grand Canyon. Same evidence, right? We agree that it exists. Well, my interpretation of the evidence is that the Earth is a living, breathing creature, and that the Grand Canyon is the analog of an anus. This anus has many layers of rocks that were formed whenever the Earth flatulated through its geological rectum. The high-pressure winds that were expelled from this massive terrestrial bunghole would have eroded the rocks at the bottom of the canyon and sent them flying to the top of the canyon, making new layers as it did so. This accounts for the depth of the Grand Canyon. The more gas it expelled, the deeper it became and the higher the rocks get piled on the sides. In fact, the energy released from these earth-shattering farts would have been enough to cause nuclear fusion in the surrounding stone, changing the composition of whatever minerals happened to be at the bottom before they were flung to the top. This explains why there are so many different layers to the Grand Canyon. Same evidence, different interpretation, equal validity. Right, Ham? Wrong. There are an infinite number of models that are as full as crap as the one that I've just presented, and none of them hold any water because none of them have any predictive capabilities. Given any arbitrary set of evidence, any conclusion, regardless of how weakly the evidence supports it, can be defended. This is what lawyers get paid to do, and it is not science. I will reiterate one final time, Ken. The only scientific models that matter are the ones that accurately predict future data. If a model doesn't do that, it isn't scientific.
You see, I've been emphasizing the difference between historical origin science, knowledge about the past when you weren't there, and we need to understand that we weren't there, or experimental or observational science, using your five senses in the present, the scientific method, what you can directly observe, test, repeat. There's a big difference between those two. And that's not what's being taught in our public schools, and that's why kids aren't being taught to think critically and correctly about the origins issue. We should start from the Bible, should put in our biblical glasses, and when we understand what the Bible says about the history of the universe, it gives us a whole way of thinking to explain the things of this world. For instance, remember the history of the universe from beginning to end, that God created a perfect world, marred by sin, death is a consequence. The animals were originally vegetarian before sin. Then we have the flood of Noah's day, the event of the Tower of Babel. Jesus Christ becomes a man, dies on a cross, raised from the dead. One day there'll be a new heavens and a new earth. That's the history of the universe, isn't it? From beginning to end. And what I try to get Christians to understand is that when you use that as the foundation for your thinking, you have a way of thinking to then take to fossils and to the animals and plants and to dinosaurs. But you know, it's also important to understand when talking about creation evolution, both involve historical science and observational science. You see, the role of observational science is this: it can be used to confirm or otherwise one's historical science based on one's starting point. Now, when you think about the debate topic and what I affirmed concerning creation, if our origins or historical science based on the Bible, the Bible's account of origins is true, then there should be predictions from this that we can test using observational science, and there are.
The so-called predictions that Ham is about to present are nothing more than ad hoc rationalizations and a misrepresentation of a scientific paper. I'll go more in depth once he makes his case.
For instance, based on the Bible, we'd expect to find evidence confirming an intelligence produced life. We'd expect to find evidence confirming after their kind. The Bible says God made kinds of animals and plants after their kind, implying each kind produces its own, not that one kind changes into another. You'd expect to find evidence confirming a global flood of Noah's day, evidence confirming one race of humans, because we all go back to Adam and Eve. Biologically, that would mean there's one race. Evidence confirming the Tower of Babel, that God gave different languages. Evidence confirming a young universe. Now, I can't go through all of those, but a couple of them we'll look at briefly. After their kind, evidence confirming that. In the Creation Museum, we have a display featuring replicas, actually, of Darwin's finches. They're called Darwin's finches. Darwin collected finches from the Galapagos and took them back to England, and we see the different species, the different beak sizes here. And you know, from the specimens that Darwin obtained in the Galapagos, he actually pondered these things, and how do you explain this? And in his notes, actually, he came up with this diagram here, a tree. And he actually said, I think. So he was talking about different species, and maybe those species came from some common ancestor. Actually, when it comes to finches, we actually would agree as creationists that different finch species came from a common ancestor, but a finch is what they would have to come from. But you see, Darwin wasn't just thinking about species. Darwin had a much bigger picture in mind. When you look at The Origin of Species and read that book, you'll find he made this statement: from such low and intermediate form, both animals and plants may have been developed, and if we admit this, we must likewise admit that all organic beings which have ever lived on this earth may be descended from some one primordial form. So he had in mind what we today know as an evolutionary tree of life, that all life has arisen from some primordial form. Now, when you consider the classification system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we would say, as creationists, and we have many creation scientists who've researched this, and for lots of reasons, I would say the kind in Genesis 1 really is more at the family level of classification. For instance, there's one dog kind, there's one cat kind, even though you have different genera, different species.
So a kind is a family, Ken? Then why do you have an entire order listed as the elephant kind? And while we're on the topic, does this mean that humans, orangutans, chimpanzees, and gorillas are all the same kind? After all, they all belong to the family Hominidae.
That would mean, by the way, you didn't need anywhere near the number of animals on the ark as people think. You wouldn't need all the species of dogs, just 2. Not all the species of cats, just 2. And you see, based on the biblical account there in Genesis 1, creationists have drawn up what they believe is a creation orchard. In other words, they're saying, look, there's great variation in the genetics of dogs and finches and so on. And so over time, particularly after Noah's flood, you'd expect if there were 2 dogs, for instance, you could end up with different species of dogs because there's an incredible amount of variability in the genes of any creature. And so you'd expect these different species up here, but there's limits. Dogs will always be dogs, finches will always be finches. Now, as a creationist, I maintain that observational science actually confirms this model based on the Bible. For instance, take dogs. Okay, in a scientific paper dated January 2014, that's this year, scientists working at the University of California stated this: "We provide several lines of evidence supporting a single origin for dogs and disfavoring alternative models in which dog lineages arise separately from geographically distinct wolf populations."
Based solely on the passage of the paper that Ken Ham has presented, it sounds as though the data points to dogs spontaneously popping into existence rather than gradually diverging from ancestral wolves. That's because the single passage is not representative of what the entire paper says, and therefore is a quote mine. In fact, the very next sentence says the following: "Considering a full multi-population demographic model with gene flow, we infer that dogs diverged from wolves at around 15,000 years ago." What this paper is actually discussing is that the origin of domestic dogs can be traced back to a single population of wolves rather than several geographically distinct ones. Since wolves and domestic dogs both belong to the same family, though, I'm sure that Ken Ham wouldn't have a problem with this. So what's the deal? Let's take a look at what he says next.
And they put this diagram in the paper. By the way, that diagram is very, very similar to this diagram that creationists proposed based upon the creation account in Genesis. In other words, you have a common dog ancestor that gives rise to the different species of dogs, and that's exactly what we're saying here.
If you look closely at the diagram that Ken Ham presented, you can see that he flipped it upside down. If you look at the original, you can also see that the time scale goes back 400,000 years. So in addition to omitting the calculations from the paper that suggest that dog diversification took place over thousands of years, Ham spun the entire article by equivocating his definition of dog with the paper's definition in order to construct a cladogram that more closely resembled the scientific one, which he then had to flip upside down to make this purely aesthetic and unscientific comparison. Basically, in order for Ham to construct his case, he had to carefully select a part of the article that superficially seemed to agree with his point, while disregarding the bulk of the article that didn't agree with him, manipulate his terms in such a way that it would seem as though the article agreed with him, and finally drew a meaningless comparison between a couple of cladograms. As it happens, it's not wrong to say that dogs, wolves, and foxes all share a common ancestor. Evolutionary theory and Ham's version of creationism are both compatible with this. It is wrong, however, to say, as Ham did, that this is the entire cladogram, and to ignore the overwhelming evidence that the common ancestors to canids, felines, ursids, and other mammalian carnivores also shared a common ancestor. The evidence supporting this used the same methods that were used to draw the conclusions in the article that Ham quote-mined, so why does he reject this fact?
Now, in the Creation Museum, we actually show the finches here, and you can see the finches with their different beaks beside dog skulls, different species of dogs. By the way, there's more variation in the dog skulls here than there are in these finches. Yet the dogs, well, that's never used as an example of evolution, but the finches are, particularly in the public school textbooks. Students are taught, see the changes that are occurring here? And here's another problem that we've got. Not only has the word science been hijacked by secularists, I believe the word evolution has been hijacked by secularists. The word evolution has been hijacked using what I call a bait and switch. Let me explain to you. The word evolution is being used in public school textbooks, and we often see it in documentaries and so on. It's used for observable changes that we would agree with, and then used for unobservable changes, such as molecules to man. Let me explain to you what's really going on, because I was a science teacher in the public schools, and I know what the students were taught, and I check the public school textbooks anyway to know what they're taught. See, students are taught today, look, there's all these different animals, plants, but they're all part of this great big tree of life that goes back to some primordial form. And look, we see changes in finches, changes in dogs, and so on. Now, we don't deny the changes. You see that. You see different species of finches, different species of dogs. But then they put it all together in this evolutionary tree. But that's what you don't observe. You don't observe that. That's belief there. That's their historical science that I would say was wrong.
Ken Ham's argument is essentially a rehashing of the common creationist position that they accept microevolution but not macroevolution, terms which, like historical and observational science, have no serious distinction. We can use our observations of relatively small changes over successive generations that gradually accumulate into larger changes to extrapolate backwards. This is a perfectly valid manner of conducting science as long as the model that is formed makes predictions, and indeed it does. I just don't see how Ken Ham can logically justify the position that small changes can't accumulate to large ones. Does he seriously believe that we need to observe every stage of this process in order to accept it? If that is indeed his position, then surely he does not believe that Pluto orbits the Sun. After all, we've discovered Pluto only about 90 years ago, and its orbital period is about 2.5 centuries, so by Ken Ham's logic, the fact that we've only ever witnessed small steps in Pluto's trajectory must mean that we're not justified in believing that it goes around the Sun.
But you know what you do observe different species of dogs, different species of finches, but then there are limits, and you don't see one kind changing into another. Actually, we're told that if you teach creation in the public schools, that's teaching religion. If you teach evolution, that's science. And I'm going to say, wait a minute. Actually, the creation model here, based upon the Bible, observational science confirms this. This is what you observe. You don't observe this tree. Actually, it's the public school textbooks that are teaching a belief, imposing it on students, and they need to be teaching them observational science to understand the reality of what's happening. Now, what we found is that public school textbooks present the evolutionary tree as science, but reject the creation orchard as religion. But observational science confirms the creation orchard.
Creationism is not corroborated by any evidence because it doesn't make any predictions, but let's pretend for a moment that these classification systems are the exclusive domain of creationism and not just an ad hoc rationalization that borrows from compatible aspects of evolutionary theory. Presenting a minuscule subset of your beliefs that, at a superficial level, may seem justified, and then demanding that the remaining beliefs that pertain to creationism are by extension justified, is committing the fallacy of guilt by association.
So public school textbooks are rejecting observational science and imposing a naturalistic religion on students. The word evolution has been hijacked using a bait and switch to indoctrinate students to accept evolutionary belief as observational science. Let me introduce you to another scientist, Richard Lenski, Michigan State University. He's a great scientist. He's known for culturing E. coli in the lab. And he found there were some E. coli that actually seemed to develop the ability to grow on substrate, on citrate in the substrate. But Richard Lenski is here mentioned in this book, and it's called Evolution in the Lab. So the ability to grow on citrate is said to be evolution. And there are those that say, hey, this is against the creationists. For instance, Jerry Coyne from University of Chicago says, Lenski's experiment is also yet another poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists. He says the thing I like most is that it says you can get these complex traits evolving by a combination of unlikely events. But is it a poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists? Is it really seeing complex traits evolving? What does it mean that some of these bacteria are able to grow on citrate? Let me introduce you to another biblical creationist who is a scientist.
Hi, my name is Dr. Andrew Fabich. I got my PhD from the University of Oklahoma in microbiology. I teach at Liberty University, and I do research on E. coli in the intestine. I've published in secular journals from the American Society for Microbiology, including infection immunity and applied environmental microbiology, as well as several others. My work has been cited even the past year in the journals Nature, Science Translational Medicine, Public Library of Science, Public Library of Science Genetics. It's cited regularly in those journals. And while I was taught nothing but evolution, I don't accept that position, and I do my research from a creation perspective.
Andrew Fabich, as he just mentioned, is on the payroll of Liberty University, a second-rate academic institution that promotes creationism. As with the other aforementioned creationist scientist, he has never published a single article in any peer-reviewed journal on any topics pertaining to creationism. The experiment under discussion is the famous E. coli experiment headed by Dr. Richard Lenski, a professor of Michigan State University. Over the course of 20 years, he has bred 50,000 generations of 12 populations of E. coli whose environments were manipulated to impose selective pressures onto the bacteria. Somewhere between generations 30,000 and 35,000, one of the 12 populations of the bacteria were found to have evolved the ability to ingest and metabolize the citrate that they were living in. This wasn't a trivial adaptation either, because E. coli's inability to ingest citrate is one of the main distinctions that it has from its close cousin, Salmonella. This is a big deal because this was macroevolution observed in action. A series of mutations allowed an organism to gain a new function. Now let's hear the creationists try to rationalize why this isn't evolution.
I look at the evidence that people cite of E. coli supposedly evolving over 30 years, over 30,000 generations in the lab, and people say that it is now able to grow on citrate. I don't deny that it grows on citrate, but it's not any kind of new information. The information's already there, and it's just a switch that gets turned on and off, and that's what they reported in there. There's nothing new.
Of course, this is a lie. Assuming that he's defining information as the nucleotide combination that ultimately gives rise to these organisms' characteristics, what he's basically saying is that the genes responsible for this adaptation had been in the E. coli from the start and were merely switched on. Ken Ham will later clarify that this is what is meant. Before I debunk this claim, some background is in order. There are some genes out there that can be switched on and off by what are called genetic switches, which are basically just proteins that affect the expression of DNA by reacting to certain signals. This is not what the article reported. The ability to digest citrate came from a potentiating mutation, which is basically a mutation that requires another specific mutation in order to work. This potentiating mutation itself was found to require at least 2 mutations to take place prior to it, meaning that it did not exist in the original generation. In fact, this potentiating mutation did not exist in any of the generations that preceded generation 20,000. Trust me, they searched for it. The researchers had frozen earlier generations of E. coli, and they were able to go back and search for the genes that would have potentially allowed the E. coli to adapt the way it did. They didn't find them. So when this creationist says,
it's not any kind of new information. The information's already there, and it's just a switch that gets turned on and off, and that's what they reported in there. There's nothing new.
he is lying. The genes necessary for this adaptation required at least 3 mutations, and none of them were present in the original generation.
See, students need to be told what's really going on here. Certainly there's change, but it's not change necessary from molecules to man. Now, we could look at other predictions. What about evidence confirming one race? Well, when we look at the human population, we see lots of differences. But based on Darwin's ideas of human evolution as presented in The Descent of Man, I mean, Darwin did teach in The Descent of Man there were lower races and higher races. Would you believe that back in the 1900s, one of the most popular biology textbooks used in the public schools in America taught this? At the present time, there exist upon Earth 5 races, or varieties of man, and finally the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. Can you imagine if that was in the public schools today? And yet, that's what was taught, but it was based on Darwin's ideas that are wrong. You have a wrong foundation. You're going to have a wrong worldview.
What Ken Ham just did was one of the most malodorous, dishonest, and underhanded fallacies of equivocation that I've ever had the displeasure of stomaching. First, let's back up a moment and define the context of the word race that Ham just equivocated. Within a biological context, race refers to the classification of organisms that are sufficiently different to be awarded this distinction, but not enough for them to be classified as subspecies. Basically, it's what biologists call organisms that may or may not deserve a taxonomic rank. If you look through the literature, you'll find that the terms ecological races, butterfly races, and even banana race are quite common. It was this use of the term that Darwin had employed in The Descent of Man. By contrast, the sociological use of the word race, whose meaning most of us are pretty familiar with, is a social construct that bears no relation to the biological use of the word. Social Darwinism is a relic of the 20th century, invented by aristocrats who, like creationists, didn't understand the theory and tried to extend its applicability beyond the scope of the discipline that it represented. Social Darwinism is not a corollary of evolutionary theory. It's a socio-political construct of post-Victorian imperialism, and academia as a whole never endorsed it. There were a few crackpot scientists who did, of course, but there will always be a few nutcases with degrees. To suggest that the theory of evolution is a license for eugenics and racism is like saying that atomic theory is an endorsement of communism, since all atoms are more or less uniform to each other, and communism is predicated on the principle that wealth should be distributed uniformly. We're all made of pretty much identical particles, so we should all have a pretty much identical standard of living. It's an equally frivolous position to hold, and Ham's use of this fallacious argument serves only to emotionally manipulate the audience.
Now, had they started from the Bible and from the creation account in the Bible, what does it teach? Well, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We go through the Tower of Babel, different languages, so different people groups formed, distinct characteristics, but we'd say, you know what, that means there's biologically only one race of humans. Well, I mentioned Dr. Venter before, and he was a researcher with the Human Genome Project, and you'll remember in the year 2000, this was headline news, and what we read was this: they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome and unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. Wow, who would have guessed? But you see, there we have observational science confirming the creation account, not confirming at all Darwin's ideas.
Again, Ham presented an ad hoc rationalization and not an actual prediction. He might as well argue that creationism predicted that the sky is blue. Ham points to an observation, construes Bible stories to form a case that ends with this observation, and calls it a prediction. There is no data, no experiment, no control groups or p-values or confidence intervals. The problem is compounded by the fact that Ham is once again falling prey to the guilt by association fallacy. Ham claims that creationism predicted this fact that we all agree on, and so the remaining facets of his model must be accepted by extension.
Now, there's much more that could be said on each of these topics. Obviously, you can't do that in a short time like this, and you could do a lot more research. I suggest you visit our website at Answers in Genesis for a lot more information. So, the debate topic: is creation a viable model of origins in today's scientific era? I said we need to define the terms, and particularly the term science and the term evolution, and I believe we need to understand how they're being used to impose an anti-God religion on generations of unsuspecting students. You see, I keep emphasizing we do need to understand the difference between experimental or observational science and historical science. And you know what? The secularists don't like me doing this because they don't want to admit that there's a belief aspect to what they're saying, and there is, and they can't get away from it. Let me illustrate this with a statement from Bill Nye.
You can show the Earth is not flat. You can show the Earth is not 10,000 years old.
By the way, I agree. You can show the Earth is not flat. There's a video from the Galileo spacecraft showing the Earth, and speeded up, of course, but spinning. You can see it's a sphere. You can observe that. You can't observe the age of the Earth. You don't see that.
Last I checked, Ham, the first human being didn't travel to space until 1961, and so no one could have directly observed the sphericity of the Earth until at least that time. Yet we have ample documentation that the shape of the Earth has been known since antiquity, so here we have yet another example of how indirect methods of analysis can be just as reliable as direct ones. Multiple lines of evidence, most famously Eratosthenes' method of measuring the angles of shadows cast by the sun in different locations, allowed us to measure the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy as early as 200 BCE. In fact, he also would have been able to indirectly calculate the distance between the Earth and the sun. And just as this ancient Libyan was able to indirectly observe aspects of the world that were otherwise inaccessible to him, we can do the same. The distant past is not accessible to us, but that doesn't mean that we can't discover things about it.
You see, again, I emphasize there's a big difference between historical science, talking about the past, and observational science, talking about the present. And I believe what's happening is this, that students are being indoctrinated by the confusion of terms. The hijacking of the word science and the hijacking of the word evolution in a bait and switch. Let me illustrate further with this video clip, because here I assert that Bill Nye is equating observational science with historical science, and I also say it's not a mystery when you understand the difference.
Apparently, people with these deeply held religious beliefs, they embrace that whole literal interpretation of the Bible as written in English as a worldview, and at the same time, they accept aspirin, antibiotic drugs, airplanes, but they're able to hold these two worldviews. And this is a mystery.
Actually, I suggest to you it's not a mystery. You see, when I'm talking about antibiotics, aspirin, smoke detectors, jet planes, that's Ken Ham, the observational science bloke. I'm an Australian. We call guys blokes, okay? But when you're talking about creation in thousands of years or the age of the earth, that's Ken Ham, the historical science bloke. I'm willing to admit that. Now, when Bill Nye's talking about aspirin, antibiotics, jet planes, smoke detectors, he does a great job at that. I used to enjoy watching him on TV too. That's Bill Nye, the observational science guy. But when he's talking about evolution of millions of years, I'm challenging him that that's Bill Nye, the historical science guy. And I challenge the evolutionists to admit the belief aspects of their particular worldview.
You see, when I'm talking about the victim's blood being everywhere, my client's fingerprints being on the murder weapon, the pattern of slashing that matches my client's profile, that's Ken Ham, the observational science bloke. But when you're talking about the process of the victim actually being physically stabbed, that's Ken Ham, the historical science bloke. I'm willing to admit that. Now, when the prosecutor is talking about my client's DNA being at the scene of the crime, the victim's blood on my client's clothing, and my client's footprints matching the attack profile at the scene of the crime, he does a great job of that. That's the observational science guy. But when he takes the next step and accuses my client of actually going in and slashing the victim open, I contend that that's the historical science guy, and I challenge the district attorney's office to admit the belief aspect of this particular position.
Now, at the Creation Museum, we're only too willing to admit our beliefs based upon the Bible, but we also teach people the difference between beliefs and what one can actually observe and experiment with in the present. I believe we're teaching people to think critically and to think in the right terms about science. I believe it's the creationists that should be educating the kids out there, because we're teaching them the right way to think.
I want to teach you something very special this morning, and I want you to remember this, boys and girls, something you will never forget. Has any human being always been there, yes or no? No. Has any scientist always been there? No. Who's the only one who's always been there? God. Who knows everything? So, in a big loud voice, who should you always trust first, God or the scientist? God. And I want you to remember that.
I believe it's the creationists that should be educating the kids out there, because we're teaching them the right way to think.
You know, we admit our origins of historical science is based upon the Bible, but I'm just challenging evolutionists to admit the belief aspects of evolution and be upfront about the difference here. As I said, I'm only too willing to admit my historical science based on the Bible. And let me further go on and define the term creation as we use it.
At this point, Ken Ham seems to have run out of pseudoscientific things to say and has started reciting his religious script. As this is merely a long list of assertions designed to provide context for his belief system and emotionally manipulate the audience, I'll spare you the agony of having to endure this yarn, mainly because his endorsement of his religion lies outside of the scope of topics that I'm willing to discuss here.
Kathy Miller is the president of the Texas Freedom Network, and she's vocally spoken out. She's spoken out about this textbook battle there in Texas. And the mission statement of the organization she's president of says, the Texas Freedom Network advances a mainstream agenda of religious freedom and individual liberties to counter the religious right. Religious freedom, individual liberties. And then she makes this statement. Science education, what does she mean by science, should be based on mainstream science education, not on personal ideological beliefs of unqualified reviewers. Wait a minute, they want religious liberty and not personal ideological beliefs?
Individual religious liberties do not extend to the right to violate the Constitution. If you allow creationism in public schools, not only will it be the equivalent of teaching alchemy, astrology, phrenology, and divination, but the government will effectively be endorsing one particular religion over others, as well as endorsing religion in general over atheism, violating the First and 14th Amendments in the process.
I assert this. Public school textbooks are using the same word science for observational and historical science. They arbitrarily define science as naturalism and outlaw the supernatural. They present molecules to man evolution as fact, and they're imposing the religion of naturalism on generations of students. They're imposing their ideology on the students, that everything's explained by natural processes. That is a religion. What does she mean by religious liberty? They tolerate their religion. See, The battle is really about authority. It's more than just science or evolution or creation. It's about who is the authority in this world, man or God. If you start with naturalism, then what about morals? Who decides right and wrong? Well, it's subjective. Marriage, well, whatever you want it to be. Get rid of old people. I mean, why not? I mean, they're just animals. They're costing us a lot of money. Abortion, get rid of spare cats, get rid of spare kids. We're all animals. But if you start from God's word, there are moral absolutes. God decides right and wrong. Marriage, one man and one woman. Sanctity of life. We care for old people. They're made in the image of God. Life begins at fertilization, so abortion is killing a human being. We do see the collapse of Christian morality in our culture and increasing moral relativism because generations of kids are being taught the religion of naturalism and that the Bible can't be trusted.
Take note once again of how Ham attempts to alienate potential religious moderates against evolution by conflating it with an explicitly anti-God worldview. There's really not much to comment on here, as this is all just rhetorical platitude, and none of it has any basis in reality.
And so again I say, creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era. You know what? I'm a science teacher. I want to see kids taught science. I love science. I want to see more Dr. Demadians in the world. You know, if we teach them the whole universe is a result of natural processes and not designed by a creator God, they might be looking in the wrong places or have the wrong idea when they're looking at the creation in regard to how you develop technology, because if they look on it as just random processes, that could totally influence the way they think. If they understand it was a perfect world marred by sin, that could have a great effect on how they then look for overcoming diseases and problems in the world.
No, Ham, science and religion are non-overlapping magistra. A good scientist, atheist or theist, does not allow their philosophical or theological paradigms to have an effect on their work. There is only the scientific method, and the models of reality that a scientist constructs either make predictions that are accurate or are abandoned. There is no room in the process for ideology because everything is data. This is why you will never find a peer-reviewed article that defends creationism, because creationism is 100% ideology and 0% data.
I want children to be taught the right foundation, that there's a God who created them, who loves them, who died on the cross for them, and that they're special. They're made in the image of God.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Ham. We can applaud Mr. Ham's presentation. And you know, it did occur to me when you had my old friend Larry King up there, you could have just asked him. He's been around a long time, and he's a smart guy. He could probably answer it for all of us. Now, let's all be attentive to Mr. Nye as he gives us his 30-minute presentation.
At this point, Bill Nye went up and began blasting holes in Ken Ham's creation model by pointing out a number of scientific angles that corroborate an old universe, essentially skewering Ham's entire worldview. He deconstructed the plausibility of the Ark by presenting evidence that it wouldn't have been seaworthy, attacked the creation model's inability to make predictions, and most impressively of all, put forth an argument against the Noah myth that basically puts Ken Ham into checkmate. Answers in Genesis has been striving for years to explain how 2 members of every animal in the world could have fit into Noah's Ark. Naturally, their strategy has been to reduce the number of animals that would have had to have been on the Ark, mainly by using kinds as their threshold. Bill Nye showed the audience how badly this argument backfired, because with every reduction in the number of animals on the Ark, there is a corresponding need for more speciation events to account for the amount of biodiversity that we see today. According to Bill Nye's calculations, Ham's figure for the number of animals on the Ark would result in an average of 11 new species being produced every day for the last 4,000 years, which we certainly don't observe. Later in the debate, Ham will try to argue that fewer animals than his original figure would have had to have been on the Ark, and Bill will point out that this only compounds the problem because even more species would have to be produced daily. So either there were too many animals to conceivably fit onto the Ark, or there were too few animals on the Ark to account for the biodiversity that we observe.
That's a lot to take in. I hope everybody's holding up well. It's a lot of information. What we're going to have now is a 5-minute rebuttal time for each gentleman to address the other one's comments, and then there will be a 5-minute counter-rebuttal after that. Things are going to start moving a little more quickly now, so at this point in particular, I want to make sure we don't have applauding or anything else going on that slows it down. So, Mr. Ham, if you'd like to begin with your 5-minute rebuttal first.
Well, first of all, Bill, if I was to answer all the points that you brought up, the moderator would think I was going on for millions of years. So I can only deal with some of them. And you mentioned the age of the earth a couple of times, so let me deal with that. As I said in my presentation, you can't observe the age of the earth, and I would say that comes under what we call historical origin science. Now, just to understand, so you understand where I'm coming from, yes, we admit we build our origins of historical science on the Bible. The Bible says God created in 6 days. The Hebrew word yom, as it's used in Genesis 1 with evening, morning number, means an ordinary day. Adam was made on day 6. And so when you add up all those genealogies specifically given in the Bible, yeah, from Adam to Abraham, you've got 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ, 2,000 years from Christ to the present 2,000 years. That's how we get 6,000 years. So that's where it comes from, just so you know. Now, a lot of people say, now, by the way, the Earth's age is 4.5 billion years old, and we have radioactive decay dating methods that found that. But you see, we certainly observe radioactive decay, whether it's rubidium, strontium, whether it's uranium, lead, potassium, argon. But when you're talking about the past, we have a problem. I'll give you a practical example. In Australia, there were engineers that were trying to search out about a coal mine, and so they drilled down and they found a basalt layer, lava flow, that had woody material in it, branches and twigs and so on. And when Dr. Andrew Snelling, our PhD geologist, sent that to a lab in Massachusetts in 1994, they used potassium argon dating. It dated to 45 million years old. Well, he also sent the wood to the radiocarbon section of the same lab, and that dated to 45,000 years old. 45,000-year-old wood and 45 million-year-old rock. The point is, there's a problem.
Andrew Snelling is a geologist on the payroll of Answers in Genesis, and the incident that his boss is referring to is when Snelling investigated the sandstone, not basalt, in which the alleged piece of wood was found. I say alleged because neither Snelling nor Geochron, the dating lab that he submitted the result to, could identify it, though the lab did say that it looked like an iron concretion. Carbon dating this material, as anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of the process will know, was therefore a futile venture, as the unidentified material was completely mineralized, meaning that in principle there should not have been any carbon in it. As it happened, there was some carbon in the sample, but based on the porous features of the surrounding rock, this carbon likely came from groundwater and not the minerals. So in the end, what Geochron actually ended up carbon dating was the groundwater, not the rock. Another incident closely resembling this one took place in a different part of Australia, where Snelling collected samples of wood alleged by miners to have been found encased in basalt. Aside from the fact that the history of this sample was anecdotal in nature, the sample was not protected from contamination and was subsequently carbon dated to be about 45,000 years old, which is at the extreme upper limit of carbon dating, which has been known to yield large margins of error. In spite of all this, Snelling used this incident to try to cast doubt on the validity of radiometric dating methods, which is what he gets paid to do. The formula that he and his contemporaries used to disparage radiometric dating is quite simple. Take contaminated samples to labs whose dating ranges do not encompass the age of whatever was found, claim victory over basic nuclear physics in a half-baked article on the Answers in Genesis website, and take Ham's check to the bank.
Let me give you another example of a problem. There was a lava dome that started to form in the 80s after Mount St. Helens erupted. And in 1994, Dr. Steve Austin, another PhD geologist, actually sampled the rock there. He took whole rock, crushed it, sent it to the same lab, actually, I believe, and got a date of 0.35 million years. When he separated out the minerals, amphibole and pyroxene, and used potassium argon dating, you get 0.9 million, 2.8 million. My point is, all these dating methods actually give all sorts of different dates. In fact, different dating methods on the same rock we can show give all sorts of different dates.
The geologist that Ken Ham is referring to, Steve Austin, is on the payroll of the pseudoscientific organization Institute for Creation Research. As with Andrew Snelling, Steve Austin sent his samples to Geochron, whose website explicitly stated that its methods cannot accurately date samples that are less than 2 million years old. With the exception of the pyroxene, every sample dated to be considerably less than 2 million years old, rendering the use of the lab's methods futile. This does not reflect poorly on the dating method, but on the person who misused it. There are known limitations to certain dating methods, and the misuse of potassium-argon dating would most certainly give useless results. Again, this does not reflect poorly on the dating method itself. If a person uses a ruler to try to measure someone's weight, their failure to do so has nothing to do with the ruler being useless and has everything to do with its misapplication. The same holds true for radiometric dating. As Austin, for some mysterious reason, never chose to publish his results in the peer review, it is to be expected that no serious scientist would waste their time addressing this drivel. As it happens, Dr. Kevin Henke of the Geological Department at the University of Kansas took the time to examine this case in detail. He noted that Austin himself admitted that the samples were not homogeneous, which means that foreign minerals could have contaminated them. Xenocrysts would have been particularly problematic, as they have been known to contaminate geological samples. Xenocrysts are basically just crystals that get swallowed by magma. Then, when the magma rises to the surface, it cools to form solid rock, trapping the crystals inside, which predate and therefore contaminate the rock. Well, gee, I wonder where one would find a significant amount of magma that cools to form solid rock. Huh, what a coincidence. The creationist found his rock samples in one of those.
See, there's lots of assumptions in regard to radioactive dating. Number one, for instance, the amounts of the parent and daughter isotopes at the beginning when the rock formed. You have to know them, but you weren't there. See, that's historical science. Assumption two, that all daughter atoms measured today must have only been derived in situ radioactive decay of parent atoms. In other words, it's a closed system, but you don't know that, and there's a lot of evidence that that's not so.
Wrong on both objections. Ideally, we can know the initial conditions of the isotopes if we find the sample in a closed system where nothing could potentially contaminate it, but oftentimes we have to use isochron dating methods, where surrounding samples of the same element and different isotopes are all analyzed, along with the decay rates and initial daughter isotope concentration. You do not need to know the parent isotope concentration for this method, and in many cases, the assumptions of the initial conditions are perfectly reasonable. Take the potassium-argon method, for example. Minerals that are dated this way can be assumed to have a negligible amount of argon in them initially because argon is a noble gas, and noble gases don't form anything other than glow sticks and balloons. Seriously though, argon doesn't naturally react with anything but itself, so it's reasonable to assume that none of it helped form the crystal structure that's characteristic of whatever's being measured. With carbon dating, we know that the amount of the parent isotope, carbon-14, varies with time, but we can calibrate the initial amount using other methods like dendrochronology. There are other examples that show why Ken Ham's objections are nonsense, but I think that the point is made.
Assumption number three, that the decay rates have remained a constant.
This is my personal favorite creationist argument because it outlines just how desperate creationism is. To understand what I mean, you have to know a thing or two about the weak nuclear force, which is one of the four fundamental forces that shape our universe. The weak nuclear force, as with the other forces, can be reduced to individual components, or quanta, called the W and Z bosons, which are subatomic particles. These guys are pretty massive, and they're the ones who are ultimately responsible for radioactive decay. While we can't predict exactly when and where decay will occur in an atom, as the process is probabilistic and spontaneous, we do generally understand why it happens. An atom is most stable when the forces on its nucleus are balanced. The less balanced the forces, the more likely it is to experience radioactive decay. At atomic scales, gravity is pretty much negligible, but the electromagnetic and strong forces are not. Furthermore, these two forces don't really cooperate. The electromagnetic force is based on charges, which are either attractive or repulsive, but the strong nuclear force doesn't care about charge. All that it cares about is distance, kind of like gravity, except at much smaller scales. Plus, the positive and negative charges of the electromagnetic force aren't always balanced inside of the atom, so imbalances of forces in the nucleus of an atom are essentially inevitable. Radioactive decay can therefore be thought of as the mechanism by which atoms try to become more stable. In order to believe that the rate at which certain isotopes decay isn't consistent over time, you have to believe that the conditions that lead to radioactive decay have likewise not been consistent throughout time. Therefore, you have to believe that the forces acting on the nuclei of these atoms have varied tremendously. Remember that Ham believes that the Earth is 6,000 years old, about 750,000 times younger than the age that we measured using the uranium-lead dating method. Ken Ham has to believe, at least for uranium-238, but also to a lesser extent for the other radioactive elements, that the electrical and strong nuclear interactions that took place inside of these atoms were so violently unbalanced that the atoms decayed at over 750,000 times their observed rate of decay. And in order for that to be the case, the relative strengths of the electromagnetic and strong forces had to be significantly different in the past, which itself would have resulted in nearly every equation in physics to use different constants. Just take the two most fundamental constants relevant to electromagnetism, the vacuum permittivity constant and the vacuum permeability constant. The law that relates charges to the electric force and the law that relates the flow of charges to the magnetic force would have had to rely on significantly different constants of proportionality, which is a pretty big deal when you remember that everything you see is held together by electrostatic forces and are surrounded by magnetic fields. The laws of physics really do have to be different in order for Ken Ham's model to work. The irony here is that earlier, Ken Ham claimed that the laws of nature are uniform. But it gets even worse when we consider the consequences of accelerated decay rates. In fact, I can confidently say that this leads to the most breathtaking failure that creationism has ever produced. In SI units, we measure radioactivity in becquerels after the guy who co-discovered radioactivity. 1 becquerel is equal to the release of 1 radioactive nucleon per second. According to the physics department at the University of Idaho, a kilogram of uranium-238 releases on average about 25 becquerels, and the 5th edition of the McGraw-Hill Science and Technology Encyclopedia calculates that the Earth's crust contains 10 to the 17th kilograms of uranium-238. That means that the total amount of radioactive nucleotide output on Earth that is accounted for by uranium-238 is about 1.2 times 10 to the 18th becquerels. Now, the decay rate of an isotope is linearly related to both its age and the parent-daughter parameter. The parent-daughter parameter will vary with each individual sample, but the average decay rate will not for the reasons that I've already outlined, so the age of the Earth should correspond to the radiometric decay constant. Since Ham's model stipulates that the age of the Earth is 760,000 times less than its measured age, the decay rate for Ken Ham's model must have been an average of 760,000 times its actual decay rate, or about 9.1 million becquerels per kilogram. That means that the flux of Earth's radioactivity due to uranium-238 alone should be a total of about 9.1 times 10 to the 23 becquerels, or an average of about 4.6 times 10 to the 15th becquerels per square mile everywhere on the planet. To put that into perspective, the Fukushima nuclear disaster is estimated to have released a total of about 5.4 times 10 to the 14th becquerels. That means that in order for Ham's model to work, the planet released an average of about 8.5 times more radiation than Fukushima did in total every square mile, every second for the past 6,000 years. And that is being generous, as not only did I not take into account that there was more uranium and therefore more net radioactivity in the past, but also because I assumed that Ham's ridiculous decay rate was constant before magically changing to its current value when we started measuring it. This is a generous assumption because any non-constant function for the decay rate of uranium-238 would have yielded even more catastrophic results. Bear in mind, by the way, that I only considered uranium-238 in this calculation. Do the same calculation for every other major radioactive isotope out there, add them all up, and the true extent of this argument's failure will be fully revealed. I have seen creationist arguments fail time and time again, but I have never seen any of them fail quite as spectacularly as this one.
They're just some of them. There's others as well. The point is there's lots of assumptions in regard to the dating method. So there's no dating method you can use that you can absolutely age date a rock. There's all sorts of differences out there. And I do want to address the bit you brought up about Christians believing in millions of years. Yeah, there's a lot of Christians out there that believe in millions of years, but I'd say they have a problem. I'm not saying they're not Christians.
Is that so, Ken? It was only a couple of weeks before the debate when you issued the following statement on your Facebook page. Apparently, they call this sort of thing progressive Christianity. I guess that means evolving Christianity. Whatever the secular world believes about where they came from, you accept that as infallible and then change their assumed fallible word of God to fit. So sad. In many ways, these sort of people are more dangerous to Christianity than the atheists. You say that Christians can accept evolution and still be saved, but your Answers in Genesis pages on the matter suggest otherwise, and your contemporary, Ray Comfort, recently said just the opposite. Bending over backwards now, are we, Ken?
But because salvation is conditioned upon faith in Christ, not the age of the earth, but there's an inconsistency with what the Bible teaches. If you believe in millions of years, you've got death and bloodshed, suffering, disease over millions of years leading to man, because that's what you see in the fossil record. The Bible makes it very clear death is a result of man's sin. In fact, the first death was in the garden when God killed an animal, clothed Adam and Eve, first blood sacrifice pointing towards what would happen with Jesus Christ, who would be the one who would be die once and for all. Now, if you believe in millions of years as a Christian, in the fossil record, there's evidence of animals eating each other. The Bible says originally all the animals and man were vegetarian. We weren't told we could eat meat until after the flood. There's diseases represented in the fossil record, like brain tumours, but the Bible says when God made everything, it was very good. God doesn't call brain tumours very good. There's fossilised thorns in the fossil record. Instead of being hundreds of millions of years old, the Bible says thorns came after the curse. So these two things can't be true at the same time. And you know what? There's hundreds of dating methods out there, hundreds of them. Actually, 90% of them contradict billions of years.
Well, of course, Ken. Human populations, human civilizations, the Niagara Falls, and the Stone Age are not accepted to be billions of years old even by rationalists. Regarding your other examples, most of them are completely irrelevant to the age of the universe. The age of the universe is not a function of, for instance, sodium in the sea. Many of them aren't even functions of the age of the Earth, whose age certainly isn't a function of carbon-14 and meteorites. According to Ham, the dating methods that are used on each of these examples are unreliable and have been known to give varying results. Well, that's only the case when you misuse a dating method or neglect to take necessary variables into account, as the Answers in Genesis website has for each of these. I won't be able to go into depth because of time constraints, but after browsing the Answers in Genesis pages for many hours and tracking each of these claims down, here are just some of the errors that I found. According to this argument, there isn't enough helium in the atmosphere to account for an old Earth, but according to this peer-reviewed paper, its scarcity is accounted for in the following way. Helium gets ionized, meaning that it gains an electrical charge via an electron. In the process, it gains a stronger magnetic field, which makes the helium follow the Earth's magnetic field lines, and because of its extremely light weight, helium then is able to gain enough acceleration from the magnetic force to escape from the atmosphere. According to this argument, the spiral arms of galaxies should wind tighter and tighter over time, and the fact that there is no evidence of this suggests a young universe. This argument fails because spiral configurations are energetically favorable and even develop spontaneously in computer simulations based on gravitational dynamics. The very premise of the argument is wrong. According to this argument, Saturn's rings are drifting outward at a rate that makes it impossible for them to be billions of years old. As it happens, they aren't billions of years old, only about 100 million years old. The age of Saturn, however, is independent of the age of its rings, as the generally accepted model of their origin involves a small moon getting close enough to Saturn to be ripped apart by tidal forces. This could have happened at any point in Saturn's history and is in no way an indicator of its age. I could go on all day as to why these arguments fail. This one comes from the use of questionable data that didn't stand up to peer review. This one completely neglects the ecological concept of carrying capacity. This one doesn't take into account the phenomenon of tidal heating. This one ignores the fact that new comets are consistently entering the inner solar system from the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud. And this one incorrectly assumes that the human race had written records since the beginning of its existence. I think that the point is made. The reason that no creationist arguments have ever made it into the peer review is because none of them can withstand even the most basic examination.
And the point is, all such dating methods are fallible. And I claim there's only one infallible dating method. It's a witness who was there, who knows everything, who told us. And that's from the Word of God. And that's why I would say that the Earth is only 6,000 years. And as Dr. Faulkner said, there's nothing in astronomy, and certainly Dr. Snelling would say there's nothing in geology to contradict a belief in a young age for the Earth and the universe.
It's difficult for me to adequately convey the sheer magnitude of my frustration with and contempt for this man. Ken Ham, your plea to have other people trust your interpretation of a book that you arbitrarily describe as infallible over the science that is responsible for the development and innovation of modern society is quite simply mind-boggling. I honestly cannot understand why you think that rational people should take you seriously. Bill Nye voices a similar opinion in his 5-minute rebuttal and gets right to the core of why Ken Ham is wrong. The natural laws of the past cannot be capriciously dismissed simply because one asserts that they differ from the natural laws of the present, and resolving to believe in Ken Ham's interpretation of the Bible is not reasonable grounds for invoking such an extraordinary assumption.
Very good. And Mr. Ham, would you like to offer your 5-minute counter-rebuttal?
First of all, Bill, just so I just don't want a misunderstanding here, and that is the 45,000-year-old wood, or supposedly 45,000, was inside the basalt. So it was encased in the basalt, and that's why I was making that particular point.
Once again, it wasn't wood, it was an iron concretion.
And I would also say that natural law hasn't changed. As I talked about, I said we have the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and that only makes sense within a biblical worldview anyway, of a creator God who set up those laws.
Really, Ken? Then what makes you think that decay rates are subject to change when all of the evidence points to the contrary?
And that's why we can do good experimental science, because we assume those laws are true, and they'll be true tomorrow.
Which renders your distinction between observational and historical science moot, Ken.
I do want to say this, that you said a few times, Ken Ham's view or Ken Ham's model. It's not just Ken Ham's model. We have a number of PhD scientists on our own staff. I had video quotes from some scientists. It's Dr. Damadian's model, it's Dr. Fabish's model, it's Dr. Faulkner's model, it's Dr. Snelling's model, it's Dr. Purdham's model.
And none of their models are concordant with observation. At least not until they misuse analysis methods and misrepresent data. Then their models become viable.
And so it goes on. In other words, and you go on our website, and there are lots of creation scientists who agree with exactly what we're saying concerning the Bible, concerning the Bible's account of creation. So it's not just my model in that sense.
You are the boss of a number of creationists with PhDs, Ken. They are on your payroll to act as mascots in order to imbue your ministry with some credibility, and they get paid considerably more to write simple-minded, half-baked articles than they did when they published difficult, sophisticated scientific literature. These are the scientists who gave up. They're the ones who couldn't contribute anything of real substance to academia, and in their frustration, they betrayed their charge to bring knowledge to the world to instead join a business that is far easier, far more profitable, and far more indulgent toward their egos. The only thing that you have at your disposal is an arsenal of inept arguments and an army of failures.
There's so much that I could say, but as I listen to you, I believe you're confusing terms in regard to species and kinds, because we're not saying God created all those species, we're saying God created kinds, and we're not saying species got on the ark, we're saying kinds. In fact, we've had researchers working on what is a kind. For instance, there's a number of papers published on our website where, for instance, they look at dogs and they say, well, this one breeds with this one, with this one, with this one, there's this one, this one, and you can look at all the papers around the world and you can connect them all together and say that obviously represents one kind. In fact, as they've been doing that research, they have predicted probably less than actually 1,000 kinds were on Noah's Ark. Which means just over 2,000 animals, and the average size of a land animal is not that big. So, there was plenty of room on the Ark.
Less than 1,000 kinds on Noah's Ark, Ken? That means, well, I'll let Bill Nye explain.
Let's say you have 2,000 kinds instead of 7. That makes the problem even more extraordinary. Multiplying 11 by by 3.5, We get to 35, 40 species every day that we don't see. They're not extant. In fact, you probably know we're losing species due to mostly human activity and the loss of habitat.
Like I said, creationists, checkmate.
I also believe that a lot of what you were saying was really illustrating my point. You were talking about tree rings and ice layers and just talking about kangaroos getting to Australia and all sorts of things like that. But see, we're talking about the past when we weren't there. We didn't see those tree rings actually forming. We didn't see those layers being laid down.
I believe that a lot of what the prosecution was talking about was really illustrating my point. You were talking about my client's fingerprints on the knife and how my client's bloody footprints were found at the scene of the crime and all sorts of things like that. But see, we're talking about the past when we weren't there. We didn't see the victim get stabbed. Join us next time on Law & Order's Special Needs Unit.
You know, in 1942, for instance, there were some planes that were landed on the ice in Greenland, and they found them, 46 years later, I think it was, 3 miles away from the original location with 250 feet of ice buried on top of them. So ice can build up catastrophically. If you assume 1 layer a year or something like that, it's like the dating methods. You're assuming things in regard to the past that aren't necessarily true.
Ken, how thick can you get? No pun intended, by the way, because ice core dating methods have nothing to do with the thickness of the ice, and have everything to do with the layers of hoarfrost, dust, and differing electrical conductivity, which, by the way, all cross-confirm each other.
In regard to lions and teeth, most bears have teeth very much like a lion or tiger, and yet most bears are primarily vegetarian. The panda, if you look at its teeth, you'd say maybe it should be a savage carnivore. It eats mainly bamboo. The little fruit bat in Australia has really sharp teeth, looks like a savage little creature, and it rips into fruit. So just because an animal has sharp teeth doesn't mean it's a meat eater, it means it has sharp teeth.
Wrong again, Ken. Just compare the jaws of a panda and a lion. It doesn't take a genius to see which belongs to which animal. The panda's jaw contains large tough molars, which it uses to crush bamboo, while the lion has large gaping incisors and canines that it uses to rip and tear meat. As for the fruit bat, you can see that it primarily has molars.
And so again, it really comes down to our interpretation of these things. I think too, in regard to the Missoula example that you gave, you know, creationists do believe there's been post-flood catastrophism. Noah's flood certainly was a catastrophic event, but then there's been post-flood catastrophism since that time as well. And again, in regard to historical science, why would you say Noah was unskilled? I mean, I didn't meet Noah, and neither did you. And, you know, really, it's an evolutionary view of origins, I believe, because you're thinking in terms people before us aren't as good as us.
That has nothing to do with evolution and everything to do with progress and innovation, which are things that creationism is necessarily opposed to. We have the benefit of modern technology and scientific progress, owed to the collective efforts of individuals who are willing to put their personal prejudices on the shelf and focus only on the motivation to discover. In other words, individuals unlike Ken Ham.
Hey, there are civilizations that existed in the past, and we look at their technology, and we can't even understand today how they did some of the things that they did. Who says Noah couldn't build a big boat? By the way, the Chinese and the Egyptians built boats. In fact, some of our research indicates that some of the wooden boats that were built had 3 layers interlocking so they wouldn't twist like that and leak, which is why here at the Creation Museum we have an exhibit on the Ark where we've rebuilt 1% of the Ark to scale and show 3 interlocking layers like that. And one last thing concerning the speed of light, and that is, I'm sure you're aware of the horizon problem, and that is from a Big Bang perspective, even the secularists have a problem of getting light and radiation out to the universe to be able to exchange with the rest of the universe to get that even microwave background radiation. On their model, 15 billion years or so, they can only get it about halfway, and that's why they have inflation theories, which means everyone has a problem concerning the light issue. There's things people don't understand, and we have some models on our website by some of our scientists to help explain those sorts of things.
You're comparing apples and oranges, Ken. The inflationary model is largely accepted not merely as a patch to the horizon problem, but because it also works to fix a number of other problems parsimoniously. By contrast, the answers in Genesis' attempts to fix the starlight problem result in monumental failures. The first proposal is that the speed of light used to be considerably faster, but proposing this forces one to believe that the aforementioned vacuum permeability and permittivity constants were likewise different in the past, as the speed of light is equal to the inverse root of their product. In order to believe that this used to be significantly different, these had to be significantly different in the past, and these equations, among countless others, would have had to be fundamentally different. As discussed earlier, this would fundamentally change the nature of magnetic and electrical interactions, rendering the universe essentially unrecognizable. That's without even going into the mass-energy equivalence relation, which would also have been considerably different and would have had tremendous consequences for fusion reactions like the ones that power our sun. As it goes without saying, we don't observe those consequences. The second and third proposal try to use time dilation, a prediction of general relativity, to claim that light only appears to take a longer time to travel from distant objects than it actually does. The final proposal is the most pathetic one of all. God used supernatural means to make young starlight appear old. Look, Ken, the inflation model might not be perfect, but at least it doesn't propose the violation of pretty much every law of physics that we know of, and it certainly doesn't try to cop out of the problem with your supernatural excuse.
Mr. Nye, your counter-rebuttal.
Bill Nye then went up to thrash Ken Ham's overindulgent disregard for the fact that the assumptions behind dating methods are well justified, while Ham's insistence that the laws of nature used to be different were not. He also delivered that excellent death blow to Noah's Ark that I showed earlier before beseeching the audience to get involved in science and engineering.
Thank you both. Now we're going to get to the things moving a little bit faster, and I think they may be quite interesting here. It's 40 to 45 minutes, maybe a little bit more actually, we'll have a little more, for questions and answers submitted by our audience here in the Creation Museum. Beforehand, we handed out these cards to everyone. I shuffled them here in the back, and in fact I dropped a lot of them, and then I scooped them up again. And if you saw me sorting through them here, it was to get a pile for Mr. Nye and a pile for Mr. Ham, so that we can alternate reasonably between them. Other than that, the only reason I will skip over one is if I can't read it, or if it's a question that I don't know how to read because it doesn't seem to make any sense, which sometimes happens just because of the way people write. What's going to happen is we're going to go back and forth between Mr. Nye and Mr. Ham. Each debater will have 2 minutes to answer the question addressed to him, and then the other will have 1 minute to also answer the question, even though it was addressed to the other man. And I did pull one card aside here because I noticed it was to both men. So we may be able to get to that at some point. Mr. Ham, you've been up first. If you'll hop up first this time, and Mr. Nye, you can stand by for your responses. 2 minutes. How does creationism account for the celestial bodies, planets, stars, moons, moving further and further apart? And what function does that serve in the grand design?
Well, when it comes to looking at the universe, of course, we believe that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and I believe our creationist astronomers would say, yeah, you can observe the universe expanding. Why God is doing that? In fact, in the Bible, it even says he stretches out the heavens.
Yes, and the verse that you're referring to continues by saying that God spread the heavens like a tent. The rest is just preaching, and Bill Nye responded by expressing his dissatisfaction with Ham's paradigm and how Ham was too content with saying God did it, rather than trying to understand how it was done.
That's time. Mr. Nye, the next question is for you. How did the atoms that created the Big Bang get there?
Bill Nye's answer to this question was honest and heartfelt. His joy in the prospect that there was more to learn was apparent in his response. Let's see how Ham's response compares.
Bill, I just want to let you know that there actually is a book out there that actually tells us where matter came from. And the very first sentence in that book says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
What frustrated me more than Ham's vacuous platitude was the laughter that it elicited from the audience, which left me despairing at the state of our species. It's possible that when I first heard this reply, I may have overreacted a little bit, but whatever. Let's continue.
And really, that's the only thing that makes sense. It's the only thing that makes sense of why not just matter is here, where it came from, but why matter, when you look at it, we have information and language systems that build life, not just matter. And where did that come from? Because matter can never produce information. Matter can never produce a language system. Languages only come from intelligence. Information only comes from information.
I'll go more in depth as to why this argument fails in a future video, but for the time being, it is sufficient to say that any arrangement, natural or designed, implies information. Information is merely how the arrangement is described. A number of misconceptions are present in this argument, but the overriding logical fallacy here is that Ken Ham is arguing from ignorance. He doesn't know how complex systems whose processes can be described in terms of information arose, therefore their existence must be supernatural.
The Bible tells us that the things we see, like in the book of Hebrews, are made from things that are unseen. An infinite creator God who created the universe, created matter, the energy, space, mass, time, universe, and created the information for life. It's the only thing that makes logical sense.
All right, Mr. Ham, a new question here. The overwhelming majority of people in the scientific community have presented valid physical evidence, such as carbon dating and fossils, to support evolutionary theory. What evidence besides the literal word of the Bible supports creationism?
Well, first of all, I often hear people talking about the majority. I would agree that the majority of scientists would believe in millions of years. The majority would believe in evolution, but there's a large group out there that certainly don't. But the first thing I want to say is that it's not the majority that's a judge of truth. There have been many times in the past when the majority have got it wrong. The majority of doctors in England once thought after you cut up bodies you could go and deliver babies, and wonder why the death rate was high in hospitals till they found out about diseases caused by bacteria and so on. The majority once thought the appendix was a leftover organ from our evolutionary ancestry, so when it's okay, rip it out. When it's disease, rip it out. Rip it out anyway. But these days we know that it's for the immune system, and it's very, very important. So, first it's important to understand that just because a majority believes something doesn't mean that it's true.
Aside from the fact that Ken Ham grossly overstated the importance of the appendix, his statement that the majority isn't always correct seems to be the only thing that he has going for him. But as a wise man once said, the fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who were laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. Ken Ham, you and your contemporaries are not Columbus or Fulton or the Wright brothers. You are clowns.
And then, I'm sorry, I missed the last part of the question there.
What was the... Make sure I have the right question here.
About carbon dating.
So what evidence besides the literal word of the Bible supports creationism?
Well, one of the things I was doing was I was making predictions. I made some predictions. There's a whole list of predictions. And I was saying, if the Bible's right, and we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, there's one race. And I went through and talked about that. If the Bible's right and God made kinds, I went through and talked about that.
These are not predictions, Ken. These are ad hoc rationalizations. An example of a valid prediction would be, if there was a global flood, there should be evidence of it in the geological record. There should be a layer of flood detritus that spans the entire globe, and this layer has to exhibit graded bedding. As it happens, of course, no such layer has ever been found, and that's how we know that the global flood never took place.
And so, really that question comes down to the fact that we're again dealing with the fact there's aspects about the past that you can't scientifically prove because you weren't there, but observational science in the present. Bill and I all have the same observational science. We're here in the present. We can see radioactivity, but when it comes to then talking about the past, you're not going to be scientifically able to prove that, and that's what we need to admit.
We're again dealing with the fact that there are aspects about the past that scientifically prove because you weren't there with observational science in the present. The prosecutor and I have the same observational science. We're here in the present, we can see the dead body, we can see the victim's blood on my client's knife, but when it comes to talking about the past, you're not going to be able to scientifically prove that my client murdered the victim, and that's what we need to admit.
But we can be great scientists in the present, as the examples I gave you of Dr. Damadian or Dr. Stuart Burgess or Dr. Fabich, and we can be investigating the present. Understanding the past is a whole different matter.
Mr. Nye, 1 minute response.
Bill Nye then proceeded to explain to Ham why his idea regarding the persecution of scientists with new ideas was bogus. The scientific enterprise functions only because scientists are eager to find new explanations for existing phenomena, and the dismissal of models that correspond to reality would be counterproductive in the extreme. After he was finished, he was asked by the moderator how consciousness came from matter, and Bill Nye once again answered honestly that neither he nor anyone else knew. He then elaborated on the joy of discovery and the hopeful and optimistic view that science takes, being inherently progressive and toiling to push humanity to the stars. Ken Ham's reply was unsurprising, but was nonetheless incredibly disappointing.
Bill, I do want to say that there is a book out there that does document where consciousness came from. And in that book, the one who created us said that he made man in his image, and he breathed into man, and he became a living being. And so the Bible does document that. That's where consciousness came from, that God gave it to us. And the other thing I want to say is, I'm sort of I have a mystery. And that is, you talk about the joy of discovery, but you also say that when you die, it's over, and that's the end of you. And if when you die, it's over, and you don't even remember you were here, what's the point of the joy of discovery anyway? I mean, in an ultimate sense. You won't ever know you were ever here, and no one who knew you will know they were ever here ultimately, so what's the point anyway? I love the joy of discovery because this is God's creation, and I'm finding more out about that to take dominion for man's good and for God's glory.
What a selfish and close-minded way of looking at the world, that the joy of discovery can be motivated only when there's a promise of eternal life involved. I think that it's appropriate at this point to illustrate the difference between these two men, as this becomes a very important theme of the debate from here on out. Both of these men have a comparable amount of education. Bill Nye was an engineering major, and Ken Ham was an applied science major. I've heard it said elsewhere, but I'd like to reiterate it here. Where Bill Nye used his education to work for Boeing, and then coupled his talent for entertainment with his strong foundational knowledge of science to inspire young people to innovate, Ken Ham used his rudimentary understanding of the same science to create a multi-million-dollar business by peddling a skewed and perverted version of it to the gullible and the uninformed. While it takes one kind of person to reach out to children and show them the majesty and accessibility of a universe beyond the reach of our bodies simply by using our minds, it takes quite another kind of person to teach children that accessing new knowledge is a danger to be avoided, and that all new knowledge must pass through a filter of conformity and brainwashing.
Well, let's see how we go here. I'm going to ask you some questions, and we'll see how we go. Next time somebody says millions of years ago, what do you say to them? Were dinosaurs on the ark? On what day of creation were dinosaurs made? 6 days. Can you add millions of years into the Bible? What came into the world because of sin? Could you have had death and disease millions of years before Adam sinned? What happened to the dinosaurs? Is there any mystery? What do I call dinosaurs? Missionary lizards. Could there be a dinosaur described in detail in the Bible? What was its name? In which book is it found? Chapter. Verse. If there really was a global flood, what would you expect to find? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. Do you think the kangaroo was designed? Let's say our little saying together. Are you ready? It's designed to do what it does do, what it does do, it does do, the world doesn't do, yes it does, I think it does do, you won't do, hope you do, two to you. Who got that? The two of you. Yeah. Next time somebody says millions of years, what do you ask? How old would most of your fossils be? 4,500 years. But what happens when somebody says millions of years? Oh, were you there? Well, I think we've thoroughly taught you.
For me, this shines as clear a light as any as to the extent of the mental illness that Ken Ham and his ilk share. Words fail to describe the character of this man, who has the nerve to lecture Bill Nye on the joy of discovery when all that Ham has ever done to children is stifle their capacity and desire to learn.
Mr. Ham, a new question. This is a simple question, I suppose, but one that actually is fairly profound for all of us in our lives. What, if anything, would ever change your mind?
That blank stare is, for me, the most telling part of this debate. This moment outlines what is perhaps the most striking difference between Ken Ham and Bill Nye. It would be redundant for me to say anything else on the matter, as their responses speak for themselves.
Well, the answer to that question is, I'm a Christian. And as a Christian, I can't prove it to you, but God has definitely shown me very clearly through his word and shown himself in the person of Jesus Christ. The Bible is the Word of God. I admit that that's where I start from. I can challenge people that you can go and test that. You can make predictions based on that. You can check the prophecies in the Bible. You can check the statements in Genesis. You can check that. And I did a little bit of that tonight. And I can't ultimately prove that to you. All I can do is to say to someone, look, if the Bible really is what it claims to be, if it really is the Word of God and that's what it claims, then check it out. And the Bible says if you come to God believing that He is, He'll reveal Himself to you. And you will know. As Christians, we can say we know. And so as far as the Word of God is concerned, no. No one's ever going to convince me that the Word of God is not true. But I do want to make a distinction here, and for Bill's sake, we build models based upon the Bible, and those models are always subject to change. The fact of Noah's flood is not subject to change. The model of how the flood occurred is subject to change because we observe in the current world, and we're able to come up with maybe different ways this could have happened or that could have happened, and that's part of that scientific discovery. That's part of what it's all about. So the bottom line is that as a Christian, I have a foundation, but as a Christian, I would ask Bill the question, what would change your mind? I mean, you said even if you came to faith, you'd never give up believing in billions of years. I think I quoted you correctly. You said something like that recently. So that would be also my question to Bill.
Time. Mr. Nye?
We would just need one piece of evidence. We would need the fossil that swam from one layer to another. We would need evidence that the universe is not expanding. We would need evidence that the stars appear to be far away, but they're not. We would need evidence that rock layers can somehow form in just 4,000 years instead of the extraordinary amount. We would need evidence that somehow you can reset atomic clocks and keep neutrons from becoming protons. You bring on any of those things, and you would change me immediately. The question I have for you, though, fundamentally, and for everybody watching, Mr. Ham, what can you prove? What you have done tonight is spent all the time coming up with explanations about the past. What can you really predict? What can you really prove in a conventional scientific or in a conventional, I have an idea that makes a prediction and it comes out the way I see it? This is very troubling to me.
What would change your minds? Bill Nye? Evidence. Ken Ham? Nothing. Creationism isn't science, and nothing makes that more clear than Ken Ham's response.
Mr. Nye, a new question.
Bill Nye at this point was asked what evidence other than radiometric dating would convince him of the age of the Earth. He briefly mentioned depositional rates, but ultimately the question is trivial because radiometric dating by itself is pretty compelling. It's like asking what you would use to measure your height other than rulers, yardsticks, and meter sticks. It's superfluous.
And that is time. Mr. Ham, your response.
By the way, just want people to understand too, in regard to the age of the Earth being about 4.5 billion years, no Earth rock was dated to get that date. They dated meteorites, and because they assumed meteorites were same age as the Earth, left over from the formation of the solar system, that's where that comes from. People think they dated rocks on the Earth to get the 4.5 billion years. That's just not true.
Actually, the uranium dated in the meteorites establishes only an upper limit to the age of the Earth. This makes sense since the leading model in the origin of the solar system posits that these structures formed via accretion. A lower limit can, however, be given by zircon crystals from the Jack Hills of Western Australia, which dated to be about 4.4 billion years old.
And the other point that I was making, and I just put this slide back up because I happen to just have it here, and that is, I said at the end of my first rebuttal time that there are hundreds of physical processes that set limits on the age of the Earth. Here's the point. Every dating method involves a change with time, and there are hundreds of them. And if you assume what was there to start with, and you assume something about the rate, and you know about the rate, you make lots of those assumptions. Every dating method has those assumptions. Most of the dating methods, 90% of them, contradict the billions of years. There's no absolute age dating method from scientific method because you can't prove scientifically young or old.
I've already explained why Ham is wrong about this, but I'd like to add one more thing. When he said that there is no absolute age dating method, he was right. We cannot be absolutely certain about anything in science, but we can have enough confidence in our results to accept them. The meter, for example, is currently defined by the length of the path traveled by light during this time interval. Here's the problem, though. Our definition of a meter has an uncertainty of 10 millionths of a millimeter. That means that even in a perfect vacuum, where nothing can interfere with your measurements, if you try to measure 10 billion meters, you're going to be off by 1 meter. For the purposes of functionality, this is a perfectly acceptable margin of error, but when you're talking about absolutes, that implies epistemological certainty, and no physical measurements of anything, be it length, time, or whatever, meets that standard. If you reject radiometric dating on the grounds that it isn't absolute, then I have bad news for you. Nothing in science is absolute. Everything is tentative and subject to revision and correction, and everything is susceptible to a certain degree of error. The biggest difference at the most fundamental level between the scientific model and the creationist model is the degree of error. It's a little wrong to say that a tomato is a vegetable, but it's very wrong to say that a tomato is a suspension bridge. Canaham's beliefs are akin to saying that a tomato is a spiral galaxy.
And here is a new question. It starts with you, Mr. Ham. Can you reconcile the change in the rate continents are now drifting versus how quickly they must have traveled at creation 6,000 years ago?
The rate, sorry, I missed that word.
Can you reconcile the speed at which continents are now drifting today to the rate they would have had to have traveled 6,000 years ago to reach where we are now? I think that's the question.
Okay, I think I understand the question. Actually, this again illustrates exactly what I'm talking about in regard to historical science and observational science. We can look at continents today, and we have scientists who've written papers about this on our website. I'm definitely not an expert in this area, I don't claim to be, but there are scientists, even Dr. Andrew Snelling, our PhD geologist.
Could you please stop name-dropping and just answer the question already?
Has done a lot of research here too as well, and there are others out there into plate tectonics and continental drift. And certainly we can see movements of plates today. And if you look at those movements, and if you assume the way it's moving today, the rate it's moving, that it's always been that way in the past, see, that's an assumption. That's the problem when it comes to understanding these things. You can observe movement, but then to assume that it's always been like that in the past, that's historical science. And in fact, we would believe basically in catastrophic plate tectonics, that as a result of the flood, at the time of the flood, there was catastrophic breakup of the Earth's surface. And what we're seeing now is sort of, if you like, a remnant of that movement. And so we do not deny the movement, we do not deny the plates. What we would deny is that you can use what you see today as a basis for just extrapolating into the past.
This catastrophic breakup model suffers from a number of problems, among them that it is a far less parsimonious model than the scientific one, and is unable to account for phenomena that the scientific one can exclusively, like why there's gold in California, salt mines in Utah, silver in Nevada, and coal in Pennsylvania. In addition, the elevation of the seafloors can be accounted for only by gradual plate tectonic activity. The same holds true for the existence of island chains and guyats.
It's the same with the flood. You can say, well, layers today only get laid down slowly in places, but if there was a global flood, that would have changed all of that. Again, it's this emphasis on historical science and observational science. And I would encourage people to go to our website at Answers in Genesis, because we do have a number of papers, in fact, very technical papers. Dr. John Baumgartner is one who's written some very extensive work dealing with this very issue. On the basis of the Bible, of course, we believe there's one continent to start with because the waters were gathered together into one place. So we do believe that the continent has split up, but particularly the flood had a lot to do with that.
And time on that. Mr. Nye, a response.
Bill Nye's rebuttal was brief but effective, as he pointed out how the magnetic record in oceanic sediment was consistent with gradual seafloor spreading, as opposed to Ken Ham's chaotic machinations of the Earth's crust having a seizure.
This is a question for you, Mr. Nye, but I guess I can put it to both of you. One-word answer, please. Favorite color?
I will go along with most people and say green, and it's an irony that green plants reflect green light.
Did I not say one-word answer?
Most of the light.
I said one-word answer.
Most of the light from the sun is green, yet they reflect it. It's a mystery.
Well, can I have 3 words, and you see, had 300?
You can have 3.
Okay. Observational science, blue.
All right.
I understand that this was a light-hearted moment, but I'd like to point out an observation made by a close acquaintance of mine. Bill Nye lit up when he gave his answer. He was excited to talk about some science concerning green light, and communicating his enthusiasm to the audience clearly gave him joy. Ken Ham's reply, on the other hand, was cold, calculating, and served only to drive an illusory distinction between science concerning the past and science concerning the present. Their responses to this question alone don't necessarily have any bearing on their goals and characters, but they do seem to be a clear reflection of what these guys are interested in and how they differ.
We're back to you, Mr. Nye. How do you balance the theory of evolution with the second law of thermodynamics? And I'd like to add a question here. What is the second law of thermodynamics?
I won't go into detail about this question here, but I will refer you to an earlier video of mine, The Arrogance of Creationism 2, where I deal with it extensively.
Let me just say two things, if I can, if a minute goes that fast or long. One is, you know what? Here's a point we need to understand. You can have all the energy that you want, but energy or matter will never produce life. God imposed information, language system, and that's how we have life. Matter by itself could never produce life, no matter what energy you have.
Again, I will go into detail about why this argument fails in a future video, but for the time being, it will suffice for me to note that he is arguing from ignorance again.
And, you know, even if you've got a dead stick, you can have all the energy in the world in that dead stick. It's going to decay, and it's not going to produce life. From a creationist perspective, we certainly agree. I mean, before man sinned, you know, there was digestion and so on, but because of the fall, now things are running down. God doesn't hold everything together as he did back then. So now we see, in regard to the second law of thermodynamics, we'd say it's sort of, in a sense, a bit out of control now compared to what it was originally, which is why we have a running down universe.
According to Ken Ham, the second law of thermodynamics existed prior to the fall, as he mentioned digestion, but to a lesser extent than today? That doesn't even make any sense. Are you changing the laws of physics to suit your agenda again?
And that's time. A new question for you, Mr. Ham. Hypothetically, if evidence existed that caused you to have to admit that the earth was older than 10,000 years and creation did not occur over 6 days, would you still believe in God and the historical Jesus of Nazareth, and that Jesus was the Son of God?
Well, I've been emphasizing all night. You cannot ever prove using the scientific method in the present, you can't prove the age of the earth. So you can never prove it's old. So there is no hypothetical because you can't do that. Now, we can certainly use methods in the present and making assumptions. I mean, creationists use methods that change over time. As I said, there's hundreds of physical processes that you can use, but they set limits on the age of the universe, but you can't ultimately prove the age of the earth, not using the scientific method.
You can't even entertain the hypothetical possibility of being wrong, can you, Ken? No, and this is precisely why creationism is such an anti-scientific enterprise. Because you don't care if you're wrong or not. Your only goal is to defend the indefensible.
You can't ultimately prove the age of the universe. Now, you can look at methods, and you can see that there are many methods that contradict billions of years, many methods that seem to support thousands of years. As Dr. Faulkner said in the little video clip I showed, there is nothing in observational astronomy that contradicts a young universe.
Really? How about objects that are hundreds of millions, even billions of light years away?
Now, I've said to you before, and I admit again, that the reason I believe in a young universe is because of the Bible's account of origins. I believe that God, who has always been there, the infinite creator God, revealed in his word what he did for us. And when we add up those dates, we get thousands of years. But there's nothing in observational science that contradicts that. But as far as the age of the earth, the age of the universe, even when it comes to the fossil record, that's why I really challenge Christians. If you're going to believe in millions of years for the fossil record, you've got a problem with the Bible. And that is that then you've got to have death and disease and suffering before sin. So there is no hypothetical in regard to that. You can't prove scientifically the age of the earth or the universe. Bottom line.
I'll let Bill Nye wrap up here.
Well, of course, this is where we disagree. You can prove the age of the earth with great robustness by observing the universe around us. And I get the feeling, Mr. Ham, that you want us to take your word for it. This is to say, your interpretation of a book written thousands of years ago, as translated into American English, is more compelling for you than everything that I can observe in the world around me. This is where you and I think, are not going to see eye to eye. You asserted that life cannot come from something that's not alive. Are you sure? Are you sure enough to say that we should not continue to look for signs of water and life on Mars, that that's a waste? You're sure enough to claim that. That is an extraordinary claim that we want to investigate. Once again, what is it you can predict? What do you provide us that can tell us something about the future, not just about your vision of the past?
A new question, Mr. Nye. Is there room for God in science?
Bill Nye's answer essentially highlights my view of this question. Science and religion are non-overlapping magistra that have nothing to do with one another. There is nothing in science that points to the existence of a God, and there is nothing in any religion that validates any scientific model. Science and religion ultimately seem to serve different functions, and neither thus far has had any effect on the validity of the other. I mean this in general terms, of course. Science hasn't disproved the existence of gods in general, but it has disproved a 6,000-year-old universe.
Yeah, I actually want to take a minute to address the question. Let me just say this. My answer would be God is necessary for science. In fact, you talked about cell phones. Yeah, I have a cell phone. I love technology. We love technology here at Answers in Genesis. And I have email, and probably had millions of them while I've been speaking up here. And satellites and what you said about, the information we get, I agree with all that. See, they're the things that can be done in the present. And that's just like I showed you, Dr. Stuart Burgess, who invented that gear set for the satellite. Creationists can be great scientists. But see, I said God is necessary because you have to assume the laws of logic. You have to assume the laws of nature. You have to assume the uniformity of nature. And
Ham, I think you're a little confused. The laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and the other things that you pay lip service to were documented and discussed long before Christianity ever emerged. It's a well-known historical fact that the early churches clung to the ideas of Aristotle, and while the Ken Hams of the Dark Ages and Renaissance did use his flawed naturalistic ideas to hold science back several centuries, their entire logical paradigm was borrowed, almost without exception, from the ancient Greeks. It's your religion that's been doing the borrowing, Ken.
that was the question I had for you. Where does that come from if the universe is here by natural processes? Christianity and science, the Bible and science go hand in hand. We love science. But again, you've got to understand, inventing things, that's very different than talking about our origins. Two very different things.
Mr. Ham, a new question. Do you believe the entire Bible is to be taken literally? For example, should people who touch pig's skin, I think it says here, be stoned? Can men marry multiple women?
Do I believe the entire Bible should be taken literally? Well, remember in my opening address, I said we have to define our terms. So when people ask that question, say literally, I have to know what that person meant by literally. Now, I would say this. If you say naturally, and that's what you mean by literally, I would say, yes, I take the Bible naturally. What do I mean by that? Well, if it's history, as Genesis is, it's written as typical historical narrative, you take it as history. If it's poetry, as we find in the Psalms, then you take it as poetry. It doesn't mean it doesn't teach truth, but it's not a cosmological account in the sense that Genesis is. There's prophecy in the Bible. And there's literature in the Bible, concerning future events and so on. So if you take it as written, naturally, according to the type of literature, and you let it speak to you in that way, that's how I take the Bible.
How about the Book of Leviticus, Ken? Or as it's sometimes called, the Book of the Priests. You know, the one that says rabbits eat their own cud, or that one can cure leprosy simply by sprinkling bird bloods on oneself. The one that negates your use of the word kind by saying that there are different kinds of ravens, which renders the definition of kind as species rather than families. The one that says that people with pimples, boils, or burns have to live away from their communities. I'm pretty sure that this isn't poetry, Ken, and you'd really have to be insane to take it literally in this day and age.
It's God's revelation to man. He used different people. The Bible says that all Scripture is inspired by God, so God moved people by His Spirit to write His words.
Really, Ken? How do you know that? Were you there?
And also there's a lot of misunderstanding in regard to Scripture and in regard to the Israelites. I mean, we have laws in our civil government here in America that the government sets. Well, there were certain laws for Israel. And, you know, some people take all that out of context and then they try to impose it on us today as Christians and say, you should be obeying those laws. It's a misunderstanding of the Old Testament. It's a misunderstanding of the New Testament. And, you know, again, it's important to take the Bible as a whole, interpreting Scripture as Scripture. If it really is the Word of God, then there's not going to be any contradiction which there's not. And by the way, when men were married to multiple women, there were lots of problems. And the Bible condemns that for what it is, and the Bible is very clear. You know, the Bible is a real book. There were people who did things that were not in accord with Scripture, and it records this for us. It helps you understand it's a real book. But marriage was one man for one woman.
Is that so, Ken? The 21st chapter of Exodus seems to disagree. You remember Exodus, don't you, Ken? The book containing one of the versions of the Ten Commandments that you and your fellow fundamentalists are so keen on plastering all over our courthouses.
Jesus reiterated that in Matthew 19, as I had in my talk. And so those that did marry multiple women were wrong.
I'll let Bill Nye take this one as well.
So it sounds to me, just listening to you over the last 2 minutes, that there's certain parts of this document of the Bible that you embrace literally and other parts you consider poetry. So it sounds to me in those last 2 minutes like you're going to take what you like, interpret literally, and other passages you're going to interpret as poetic or descriptions of human events. All that aside, I'll just say scientifically, or as a reasonable man, it doesn't seem possible that all these things that contradict your literal interpretation of those first few passages, all those things that contradict that, I find unsettling when you want me to embrace the rest of it as literal. Now, as I say, am not a theologian, but we started this debate, is the Ken Ham's creation model viable? Does it hold water? Can it fly? Does it describe anything? And I'm still looking for an answer.
And time on that. Mr. Nye, here's a new question. I believe this was miswritten here because they've repeated a word, but I think I know what they were trying to ask. Have you ever believed that evolution was accomplished through way of a higher power? I think that's what they're trying to ask here. This is the intelligent design question, I think. If so, why or why not? Why could not the evolutionary process be accomplished in this way?
Bill Nye goes on to reiterate that science and religion are essentially non-overlapping magistra, while also explaining that the apparent design that the religious observe in nature can be explained more parsimoniously with scientific models.
What Bill Nye needs to do for me is to show me an example of something, some new function that arose that was not previously possible from the genetic information that was there.
If by information you mean genes, then the previously noted E. coli experiment is an excellent example. Another one is the acquired ability of Flavobacterium to digest nylon.
And I would claim and challenge you that there is no such example that you can give. That's why I brought up the example in my presentation of Lenski's experiments in regard to E. coli, and there were some that seemed to develop the ability to exist on citrate. But as Dr. Fabich said, from looking at his research, he's found that that information was already there. It's just a gene that switched on and off.
And I repeat, that is a lie. Read the original paper.
And so there is no example because, you know, information that's there in the genetic information of different animals, plants, and so on, there's no new function that can be added. Certainly great variation within a kind, and that's what we look at. But you'd have to show an example of brand new function that never previously was possible. There is no such example that you can give anywhere in the world.
Fresh question here. Mr. Ham, name one institution, business, or organization other than a church, amusement park, or the Creation Museum that is using any aspect of creationism to produce its product.
Any scientist out there, Christian or non-Christian, that is involved in inventing things, involved in a scientific method, is using creation.
Oh, you equivocating, prevaricating bastard. By creationism, what's being referred to is the periodic spontaneous creation of everything over 6 days and all of the accompanying drivel. Ham spun this question deliberately because he knows that creationism cannot produce any predictions that allow anyone to gain any capital.
They are, because they're borrowing from a Christian worldview. They're using the laws of logic. I keep emphasizing that. I want Bill to tell me, in a view of the universe, it's a result of natural processes, explain where the laws of logic came from. Why should we trust the laws of nature? I mean, are they going to be the same tomorrow as they were yesterday? And
Wow, Ken. Just wow. Hey Ham, are the decay rates of radioactive isotopes going to be the same as they were yesterday? Hey Ham, is the speed of light going to be the same as it was yesterday? Hey Ham, could you be any more self-contradictory?
in fact, some of the greatest scientists that ever lived, Isaac Newton, James Clerk Maxwell, Michael Faraday, were creationists. And as one of them said, you know, he's thinking God's thoughts after him.
Oh, so you mean to tell me that Newton, who died a century before Darwin was even born, was a creationist? Look, Ken, arguments from authority really aren't impressive, as the people here mentioning were physicists and not biologists. But even then, the fact that Newton was a brilliant man does not vindicate any of his beliefs concerning astrology and alchemy.
And that's really, modern science really came out of that thinking, that we can do experiments today and we can do the same tomorrow. We can trust the laws of logic. We can trust the laws of nature. And if we don't teach our children correctly about this, they're not going to be innovative. And they're not going to be able to come up with inventions to advance in our culture. And so I think the person was trying to get out that, see, you know, there are lots of secularists out there doing work and they don't believe in creation and they come up with great inventions. Yeah, but my point is they are borrowing from the Christian worldview to do so. And as you saw from the video quotes I gave, people like Andrew Fabich and also Dr. Faulkner have published in the secular journals. There's lots of creationists out there who publish. People might know that they're creationists because the topic doesn't specifically pertain to creation versus evolution, but there's lots of them out there. In fact, go to our website, there's a whole list there of scientists who are creationists, who are out there doing great work in this world and helping to advance technology.
Mr. Nye.
Bill Nye repeats his discontent with Ham's model's inability to predict, and briefly touches on the ethical ramifications of believing that those who don't subscribe to such a narrow and unusual range of ideas as Ham does are misguided and evil.
Mr. Nye, since evolution teaches that man is evolving and growing smarter over time, how can you explain the numerous evidences of man's high intelligence in the past?
Nye corrects the misconception that evolutionary theory demands that organisms get better in any subjective sense of the word. Fitness refers to an organism's capacity to live in a certain environment, and intellect is not necessarily a factor in every environment. Hence, natural selection, which filters out organisms with insufficient fitness, does not necessarily wipe out the weak and the stupid, only those who are unable to adapt.
Mr. Ham, a response?
I remember at university, one of my professors was very excited to give us some evidence for evolution. He said, look at this, here's an example. These fish have evolved the ability not to see. And he was going to give an example of blind cave fish. And he said, see, in this cave, they're evolving because now the ones that are living there, their ancestors had eyes, and now these ones are blind. And I remember talking to my professor, but wait a minute, now they can't do something that they could do before. They might have an advantage in this sense, in a situation that's dark like that. Those with eyes might have got diseases and died out. Those that had mutations for no eyes are the ones that survived. It's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of those who survive.
It's not enough to say that I facepalmed at this point. The frustration that I felt when I heard this cannot be described by words alone, and I wonder even now if NASA detected a resounding slap across the world as people struck their heads out of exasperation. Did you not listen to a word that Bill Nye just said? No matter. The survival of those who survive? I hope you realize that tautologies are tautological. I mean, come on, Ham. That was some Jaden Smith level BS right there.
And it's survival of those that have the information in that circumstance to survive. But it's not, you're not getting new information, you're not getting new function. There's no example of that at all. So we need to correctly understand these things.
All right. We're down to our final question here, which I'll give to both of you. And in the interest of fairness here, because it is a question to both of you, let's give each man 2 minutes on this if we can, please. And also in the interest of you having started first, Mr. Ham, I will have you start first here. You had the first word, Mr. Nye will have the last word. The question is, what is the one thing, more than anything else, upon which you base your belief?
Well, it's the one thing upon anything else which I base my belief. Well, again, to summarize the things that I've been saying, there is a book called the Bible. It's a very unique book. It's very different to any other book out there. In fact, I don't know of any other religion that has a book that starts off by telling you that there's an infinite God and talks about the origin of the universe and the origin of matter and the origin of light and the origin of darkness and the origin of day and night and the origin of the earth and the origin of dry land and the origin of plants and the origin of the sun, moon and stars, the origin of sea creatures, the origin of flying creatures, the origin of land creatures, the origin of man, the origin of woman, the origin of death, the origin of sin, the origin of marriage, the origin of different languages, the origin of clothing, the origin of nations. I mean, it's a very, very specific book, and it gives us an account of a global flood in the history and the Tower of Babel. And if that history is true, then what about the rest of the book? Well, that history also says man is a sinner, and it says that man is separated from God, and it gives us a message that we call the gospel, the message of salvation, that God's Son stepped in history to die on the cross, be raised from the dead, and offers a free gift of salvation. Because the history is true, that's why the message based on history is true. I actually went through some predictions and listed others, and there's a lot more that you can look at, and you can go and test it for yourself. If this book really is true, it is so specific, it should explain the world. It should make sense of what we see. The flood, yeah, we have fossils all over the world. The Tower of Babel, yeah, different people groups, different languages. They have flood legends, very similar to the Bible. Creation legends, similar to the Bible. There's so much you can look at, and prophecy, and so on. And most of all, as I said to you, the Bible says, if you come to God believing that he is, he'll reveal himself to you. You will know. If you search after truth, you really want God to show you as you would search after silver and gold. He will show you. He will reveal himself to you.
Mr. Nye.
Would you repeat the question?
The question is, what is the one thing more than anything else upon which you base your belief?
As my old professor Carl Sagan said so often, when you're in love, you want to tell the world. And I base my beliefs on the information and the process that we call science. It fills me with joy to make discoveries every day of things I had never seen before. It fills me to joy to know that we can pursue these answers. It is a wonderful and astonishing thing to me that you and I are somehow at least one of the ways that the universe knows itself. You and I are a product of the universe. It's astonishing. I admit, I see your faces, that we have come to be because of the universe's existence. And we are driven to pursue that, to find out where we came from. And the second question we all want to know, are we alone? Are we alone in the universe? And these questions are deep within us, and they drive us. So the process of science, the way we know nature, is the most compelling thing to me. And I just want to close by reminding everybody what's at stake here. If we abandon all that we've learned, our ancestors, what they've learned about nature and our place in it, if we abandon the process by which we know it, if we eschew, if we let go of everything that people have learned before us, if we stop driving forward, stop looking for the next answer to the next question, we in the United States will be outcompeted by other countries, other economies. Now, that would be okay, I guess, but I was born here. I'm a patriot. And so we have to embrace science education. To the voters and taxpayers that are watching, please keep that in mind. We have to keep science education in science classes.
So there you have it. Canahan bases his beliefs on the Bible, and Bill Nye bases his beliefs on evidence. The controversy between creationism and evolution in a nutshell. I'll leave you with some final words by the immortal Richard Feynman, words that Ken Ham and others like him need to seriously take heed of.
Saying that you don't understand it, meaning I don't believe it, it's too crazy, it's the kind of thing I'm not going to accept it. The other part, well, this kind, I hope you'll come along with me. You'll have to accept it. Because it's the way nature works. If you want to know the way nature works, we looked at it carefully. Look at it, that's the way it looks. You don't like it? Go somewhere else. To another universe where the rules are simpler. Philosophically more pleasing, more psychologically easy. I can't help it, okay? If I'm going to tell you honestly what the world looks like to human beings who have struggled as hard as they can to understand it, I can only tell you what it looks like, and I cannot make it any simpler. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to simplify it. I'm not going to fake it. I'm not going to tell you something like a ball bearing on a spring. It isn't. So I'm going to tell you what it really is like, and if you don't like it, that's too bad, okay?
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe.